For every aircraft that disappears, there is a final moment when everything still seems ordinary. A routine position report, a calm acknowledgement from the cockpit, or a brief request to air traffic control becomes the last confirmed trace of a flight that never reaches its destination. Decades later, those final words still echo through accident reports, search records, and cockpit transcripts, marking the precise point where certainty ends and unanswered questions begin. As you follow these final transmissions, you'll discover messages that gave no hint of the disasters about to unfold, desperate calls made while crews fought impossible emergencies, and routine reports that became the last evidence investigators would ever receive. Some eventually revealed heartbreaking truths through recovered wreckage and cockpit recordings. Others still end in silence, leaving only a handful of words to mark the place where one of aviation's greatest mysteries began. The farewell that changed aviation. Few words in aviation history have carried as much weight as those that seemed destined to be forgotten. Every day, thousands of pilots exchange routine farewells with air traffic controllers as they leave one airspace and enter another. The conversations are brief, professional, and so ordinary that they rarely attract attention beyond the people involved. Yet on one quiet night in March 2014, a simple sign-off echoed into history for an entirely different reason. It sounded no different from countless others spoken before it. But once the radio fell silent, those words became the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators, governments, satellite experts, and millions of people around the world. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport shortly after midnight on March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing. The Boeing 777-200ER carried 227 passengers and 12 crew members, representing more than a dozen nationalities. At the controls sat Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with over 18,000 flight hours, alongside First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, who was nearing the completion of his training on the Boeing 777. The aircraft itself had a strong safety record, and weather conditions along the planned route were favourable. There were no reports suggesting that the flight faced immediate danger as it climbed into the night sky. For nearly 40 minutes, everything unfolded exactly as air traffic controllers expected. H370 followed its assigned route across the South China Sea, maintaining altitude and speed while remaining in regular contact with Kuala Lumpur Area Control Centre. Modern commercial aviation depends on this continuous chain of communication. As an aircraft approaches the boundary between one country's controlled airspace and another's, responsibility for monitoring the flight transfers seamlessly between controllers. These handoffs occur thousands of times each day with little ceremony, usually lasting only a few seconds. As MH370 neared the waypoint known as Aigari, one of the final navigation points before entering Vietnamese-controlled airspace, Kuala Lumpur controllers instructed the crew to contact Ho Chi Minh Area Control. It was a completely routine instruction. Nothing in the aircraft's performance, the weather, or the cockpit communication suggested that this transfer would be anything other than another ordinary step toward Beijing. The response came moments later. Good night, Malaysian 370. There was nothing unusual about the tone. The transmission was calm, clear, and professional. To the controller who heard it, the words likely blended into countless similar farewells spoken during previous shifts. Yet those 6 words became the final verified voice communication ever received from the crew of MH370. They marked the last moment anyone on the ground heard a human voice from inside the cockpit. What happened next unfolded with astonishing speed. Less than 2 minutes after the handoff, the aircraft's secondary surveillance radar transponder stopped transmitting. To civilian air traffic control, MH370 had effectively vanished. Vietnamese controllers waited for the aircraft to establish contact, assuming the crew was changing frequencies as instructed. When no call came, they repeatedly attempted to reach the flight. Kuala Lumpur controllers also tried to re-establish communication, believing there might have been a simple misunderstanding or a radio problem. Neither side initially realized that something far more extraordinary was unfolding. The disappearance from civilian radar did not mean the aircraft itself had vanished from the sky. Military primary radar, which detects physical objects rather than transponder signals, later revealed that an unidentified aircraft believed to be MH370 had turned sharply back across the Malay Peninsula before continuing northwest over the Strait of Malacca. This unexpected manoeuvre transformed what first appeared to be a communication failure into one of the most perplexing aviation mysteries ever encountered. Investigators would later spend years reconstructing those final minutes, examining every available radar return, satellite handshake, maintenance record, and fragment of communication. One question emerged almost immediately. Why had the final radio call sounded so completely normal? Commercial pilots facing emergencies are trained to communicate problems quickly and clearly. Even subtle hints of confusion or urgency often appear in radio transmissions before an accident unfolds. MH370's farewell contained none of those warning signs. There was no indication of mechanical trouble, no request to deviate from course, and no distress call of any kind. That normality made the final message more unsettling than if it had contained panic. Attention eventually shifted toward the precise wording of the transmission itself. Early reports quoted the final message as, "All right, good night." Later releases of official information identified the last recorded words as, "Good night, Malaysian 370. The distinction may appear minor, but investigators scrutinized every syllable, hoping linguistic analysis might reveal whether either pilot sounded stressed, distracted, or under duress. Audio specialists examined cadence and tone, yet no definitive evidence emerged suggesting anything unusual in the voice itself. It remained, by every measurable standard, an ordinary farewell. As search efforts intensified, investigators faced another unprecedented challenge. With no confirmed crash location, they turned to technology that had rarely played a central role in accident investigations. Although the aircraft had disappeared from conventional tracking systems, engineers discovered that MH370 continued exchanging automated electronic handshakes with an Inmarsat communication satellite for several hours after the final radio transmission. These brief signals contained no voice communications or flight data, but they proved the aircraft remained powered and airborne long after it disappeared from civilian radar. Those satellite exchanges reshaped the investigation entirely. Rather than searching only the South China Sea, analysts calculated possible flight paths stretching across vast regions of Asia and the southern Indian Ocean. What began as a regional search quickly evolved into the largest and most expensive search operation in aviation history. Ships, aircraft, underwater vehicles, oceanographers, mathematicians, and satellite specialists from numerous countries joined an effort unlike anything attempted before. Years later, pieces of aircraft debris began washing ashore along the western Indian Ocean, including on Réunion Island and the coasts of Africa. Several fragments were conclusively identified as originating from MH370, confirming that the aircraft had ended its journey somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. Yet despite those discoveries, the main wreckage, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder have never been recovered. Without them, the final moments inside the cockpit remain beyond reach. The unanswered questions have allowed countless theories to flourish. Some suggest deliberate human action, while others point toward mechanical failure, hypoxia, or a chain of events that left the crew unable to communicate. Official investigations have examined available evidence without reaching a definitive conclusion about why the aircraft deviated from its planned route. In the absence of the aircraft itself, every theory ultimately collides with the same obstacle, the lack of direct proof. Even today, aviation experts continue to revisit the case, applying new analytical techniques to satellite data and ocean drift models in hopes of narrowing the search area further. MH370 changed how airlines, regulators, and manufacturers think about aircraft tracking, prompting international efforts to improve real-time monitoring of commercial flights so that no airliner could disappear so completely again. Yet despite technological advances inspired by its disappearance, the mystery itself remains stubbornly unresolved. Somewhere beyond those final words, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 carried its greatest secret into the darkness, the word no one could explain. Few final transmissions have inspired as much confusion as the one that reached the ground in the closing moments of a routine flight, carrying a single word that would puzzle the world for generations. Unlike the desperate maydays that often accompany aviation disasters, this message contained no obvious plea for help and no unmistakable warning that something had gone terribly wrong. Instead, it left behind a mystery so unusual that even after the fate of the aircraft itself was finally uncovered decades later, the transmission continued to resist every convincing explanation. Long before investigators debated its meaning, that strange transmission originated aboard a British South American Airways Avro Lancastrian named Stardust. On August 2, 1947, the four-engine airliner departed Buenos Aires, Argentina, on a scheduled international flight bound for Santiago, Chile. Operated by British South American Airways, the aircraft carried passengers, crew and mail across one of South America's most formidable natural barriers. Commercial aviation was expanding rapidly after the Second World War, opening routes that had once seemed impractical, but crossing the Andes remained a demanding undertaking that left little room for error. Crossing the Andes in 1947 demanded far more than following a straight line across a map. Pilots relied on a combination of dead reckoning, radio navigation, weather observations and careful calculations to estimate their position. Unlike modern aircraft equipped with satellite navigation, digital terrain displays and continuous tracking, crews flying the Andes often navigated through cloud, turbulence and powerful mountain winds with only the instruments available to them. Even experienced aviators treated the crossing with respect because the landscape below offered few opportunities for recovery if something went wrong. The Avro Lancastrian itself represented the transition from wartime aviation to civilian air travel. Developed from the famous Avro Lancaster bomber, it had been redesigned to carry passengers over long distances while retaining much of the military aircraft's structure and performance. British South American Airways used the type extensively on routes linking Europe and South America, where long-range capability was essential. By the standards of its era, Stardust was a capable aircraft, and its crew was experienced enough to handle demanding international operations. Throughout most of the journey, nothing suggested the crew had entered circumstances beyond their control. Reports exchanged during the flight indicated that progress was being made as expected, and no distress messages hinted at mechanical failure or deteriorating conditions inside the aircraft. Weather forecasts acknowledged challenging conditions over the Andes, but such forecasts were not unusual for flights crossing one of the world's longest mountain ranges. From the perspective of those monitoring the flight, Stardust was simply another airliner steadily approaching Santiago. As the aircraft neared the mountains separating Argentina from Chile, communication became increasingly important. Every position report helped ground operators estimate where the aircraft was and when it should arrive. Air traffic management during the late 1940s lacked the precision of modern radar surveillance, making radio transmissions a crucial source of information. A delayed report or unexpected silence could quickly raise concern, particularly on routes where terrain, complicated navigation and visual contact was impossible. Then came the sequence that has puzzled generations of researchers. Before contact was lost, the crew transmitted what appeared to be a routine message in Morse code indicating that the aircraft was approaching Santiago. At the end of the transmission came a single, unfamiliar word: Stendek. It was not sent once. It was transmitted 3 consecutive times. The receiving radio operator copied the letters exactly as they were heard: Stendec. No correction followed. No clarification arrived. Moments later, the aircraft disappeared from communication entirely. Unlike a distress call, the transmission offered no obvious indication that an emergency was unfolding. There was no internationally recognized signal for immediate assistance, no description of an onboard problem, and no evidence that the crew believed they were in imminent danger. If the word carried urgent meaning, it was one understood only by those aboard the aircraft. For everyone else, it became an unsolved puzzle detached from any clear context. When Stardust failed to arrive in Santiago, concern quickly turned into a major search effort. Aircraft searched valleys, glaciers and mountain slopes, while ground teams examined possible routes through the Andes. The terrain presented extraordinary difficulties. Towering peaks, rapidly changing weather, and vast stretches of snow concealed almost every trace that rescuers hoped to find. Days turned into weeks without success, and eventually the search was suspended. With no wreckage, no survivors, and no confirmed crash site, Stardust joined the growing list of aircraft whose disappearance seemed almost complete. Speculation filled the silence long before evidence ever could. Because no physical clues existed, investigators and aviation enthusiasts alike returned repeatedly to the mysterious transmission. The unusual word seemed too deliberate to ignore, yet too unfamiliar to interpret with confidence. As years passed, Stendek gradually became more famous than the aircraft itself, appearing in books, documentaries, and discussions devoted to unsolved aviation mysteries. Some believed the mysterious word concealed a navigational code, while others argued it was nothing more than a simple transmission error. One popular theory suggested that the radio operator intended to send another message, but accidentally scrambled the Morse sequence under stress or fatigue. Others proposed that the crew had abbreviated a phrase familiar only within their operation. There were suggestions that the aircraft's radio equipment distorted the transmission, or that atmospheric interference caused the receiving station to record the wrong letters. None of these explanations gained universal acceptance, because none could be demonstrated with certainty. Another possibility centered on the extreme environment surrounding the aircraft. Flying at high altitude through the Andes exposed crews to freezing temperatures, turbulence, and the physiological effects of reduced oxygen if pressurization or oxygen systems became compromised. Some researchers wondered whether hypoxia or exhaustion could have affected the radio operator's ability to transmit accurately. Yet even this theory struggled to explain why the same 6-letter sequence was sent repeatedly instead of producing random mistakes. Repetition implied intention, and intention suggested that Stendek meant something to the person sending it. As decades passed, the mystery evolved in unexpected ways. Without a crash site, some believed the aircraft had somehow cleared the Andes and disappeared elsewhere. Others suspected it had struck an isolated peak that rescuers simply could not reach. Each theory attempted to explain the missing aircraft, but none answered the lingering question left behind by its final transmission. More than half a century passed before the mountain itself finally yielded an answer to one part of the mystery. In 1998, mountaineers climbing Mount Tupungato discovered engine components and other wreckage emerging from glacial ice. Further investigations confirmed that the remains belonged to stardust. Subsequent expeditions recovered additional debris, personal belongings, and human remains, allowing investigators to reconstruct the aircraft's final moments with far greater confidence than had ever been possible before. Evidence indicated that the aircraft had flown directly into the mountains at high speed, rather than suffering an in-flight breakup or disappearing under mysterious circumstances elsewhere. Stardust had collided with Mount Tupungato, where snow and glacier movement gradually concealed the wreckage beneath layers of ice. For decades, the mountain had hidden almost every physical trace of the accident, before slowly releasing fragments as the glacier shifted. The discovery also reshaped investigators' understanding of what likely happened inside the cockpit. One widely accepted explanation suggests that the crew believed they had already crossed the higher section of the Andes and began descending toward Santiago earlier than they should have. Powerful high-altitude headwinds may have slowed the aircraft's progress significantly, causing the pilots to overestimate how far they had travelled. Without modern navigation systems to verify their exact position, the error proved catastrophic. The mountain stood where the crew believed open air lay ahead. Yet even as the crash itself became more understandable, the final transmission refused to surrender its meaning. The wreckage offered no written explanation for Stendek, and the decades spent beneath the ice had erased any possibility of recovering cockpit conversations that might have clarified the message. The discovery solved where Stardust had gone, but it did not solve what its final communication was trying to say. That enduring uncertainty has ensured the transmission remains one of aviation's most discussed unsolved riddles. Unlike mysteries driven by elaborate conspiracies or missing evidence, this one revolves around 6 letters copied carefully by a radio operator doing his job. They have been examined by linguists, historians, radio specialists, cryptographers, and aviation experts, each searching for a pattern that transforms nonsense into meaning. Despite countless interpretations, no explanation has ever achieved definitive proof. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the disappearance of Stardust is no longer the greatest mystery surrounding the flight. The mountain eventually revealed where the aircraft came to rest, how the journey ended, and why rescuers searched in vain for so many years. What it never revealed was why a crew facing one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges on Earth chose to end its final transmission with a word that no dictionary recognized and no investigation has ever fully explained. Even after the mountain finally surrendered British South American Airways Stardust, the meaning of Stendek remained buried somewhere no expedition has ever managed to reach. Fire before the silence. Among every emergency a flight crew can encounter, few leave less time for decisions than a fire spreading somewhere beyond the cockpit door. Mechanical failures can sometimes be isolated, severe weather can often be avoided, and even engine failures are situations pilots trained for repeatedly throughout their careers. Fire is different. It can hide behind panels, travel through wiring and ventilation systems, weaken critical structures, and fill an aircraft with toxic smoke long before its full extent becomes visible. By the time the first signs reach the cockpit, the emergency may already have progressed far beyond what anyone realizes, leaving only minutes to understand what is happening and even fewer to stop it. On November 28, 1987, South African Airways Flight 295 departed from Chiang Kai-shek International Airport in Taipei, Taiwan, beginning another segment of a scheduled service bound for Johannesburg, South Africa, with an intermediate stop planned in Mauritius. Known by its radio call sign Helderberg, the aircraft was a Boeing 747-244BM Combi, one of several aircraft designed to carry both passengers and cargo on the same flight. Long-haul operations such as this were routine for South African Airways, linking distant continents across thousands of kilometres of open ocean, where communication with the ground depended largely on radio reports and navigation procedures refined over decades of international aviation. Unlike a conventional passenger aircraft with seating throughout the main deck, the Boeing 747 Combi divided its interior between passengers and freight. A large cargo compartment occupied part of the main deck behind the passenger cabin, separated by a barrier designed to contain smoke and fire should an emergency occur. The configuration allowed airlines to transport valuable cargo alongside travellers while maximising the aircraft's efficiency on long-distance routes. Although the design complied with certification standards of its time, it also introduced unique challenges that would later become central to one of aviation's most debated accident investigations. Hours slipped by with the steady rhythm expected of an international flight crossing the Indian Ocean. The aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, engines settled into their familiar cadence, and routine communications continued with air traffic control. Outside the windows stretched darkness interrupted only by scattered clouds and moonlight reflecting from the ocean below. Inside the cockpit, navigation, fuel monitoring, weather observations, and position reporting followed procedures that had guided countless overnight flights before. Nothing in those early hours publicly suggested that an emergency was quietly beginning somewhere beyond the flight deck. Everything changed when signs of smoke began appearing aboard the aircraft. The precise moment the fire began has never been established with certainty, and that uncertainty continues to define much of the investigation. What is known is that the crew eventually recognized they were dealing with smoke serious enough to require immediate action. Fires aboard aircraft often produce hazards far beyond visible flames. Electrical systems may fail without warning, insulation can release toxic gases, and dense smoke can rapidly reduce visibility inside enclosed spaces. Locating the source is frequently as important as extinguishing it, yet identifying the origin can become almost impossible while the aircraft remains airborne. Rather than declaring immediate panic, the crew continued communicating with remarkable discipline as they assessed a situation growing more dangerous by the minute. Their transmissions reflected the professionalism expected of experienced airline pilots confronting an emergency at cruising altitude. Instead of emotional reactions, the radio carried concise information intended to help controllers understand the situation while the crew simultaneously worked through emergency checklists and coordinated preparations for an unscheduled landing. Every transmission represented valuable seconds divided between communicating with the ground and fighting conditions inside the aircraft. Controllers on the ground soon realized the conversation had shifted from routine flight management to an unfolding emergency. Flight 295 advised that smoke was present aboard the aircraft and requested a diversion to Sisiwusaga Ramgoolam International Airport in Mauritius. Air traffic control immediately began providing information to assist the crew's approach, calculating distances and coordinating priority handling. Hundreds of kilometers still separated the aircraft from the runway, making every minute increasingly significant. Unlike emergencies occurring near major airports, this one unfolded over one of the world's most isolated stretches of ocean. Each radio transmission revealed only fragments of what the crew was experiencing inside an aircraft no one else could see. At one point, the crew reported, "We have smoke in the cockpit." The statement was brief, yet it fundamentally changed the nature of the emergency. Smoke inside the cockpit threatens far more than visibility. It can interfere with breathing, obscure flight instruments, impair communication, and make even routine cockpit tasks extraordinarily difficult. Pilots are trained to use oxygen masks and smoke goggles under such conditions, but equipment can only reduce the effects of an environment that may already be deteriorating rapidly. The crew continued preparing for the diversion, while controllers provided updated information for the approach into Mauritius. Their voices remained controlled despite circumstances that were almost certainly worsening beyond what radio transmissions could fully describe. Investigators would later examine these exchanges repeatedly, searching for subtle clues about the progression of the emergency. Unlike cockpit voice recordings, radio communications capture only those moments when pilots speak to the outside world, leaving long intervals during which critical decisions unfold unheard. Before long, the voices that had calmly reported their situation disappeared from the airwaves altogether. Repeated attempts to re-establish contact received no response. Radar surveillance over the remote Indian Ocean was limited compared to modern standards, and controllers could only wait while uncertainty grew. Somewhere in the darkness, the aircraft had failed to reach the airport toward which it had been racing. The emergency that had begun with reports of smoke had ended in complete silence. Floating debris eventually confirmed that the aircraft had entered the Indian Ocean before reaching Mauritius. Recovery operations faced extraordinary challenges due to the depth of the water and the vast area over which wreckage had scattered. Ships and specialized teams gradually recovered structural components, cargo, personal belongings, and eventually the cockpit voice recorder. Unlike many aviation accidents occurring on land, investigators were forced to reconstruct the sequence of events using evidence retrieved from the seabed, where salt water, pressure, and time had already begun altering critical clues. Recovering answers proved far more difficult than recovering wreckage from the ocean floor. Investigators painstakingly examined damaged components for evidence of heat, fire patterns, structural failure, and possible ignition sources. Laboratory analysis revealed unmistakable indications that a significant fire had occurred before impact. Heat damage appeared in several areas of the recovered wreckage, supporting the conclusion that flames had spread while the aircraft remained airborne. Yet determining exactly where the fire started proved considerably more difficult than demonstrating that one had existed. The cockpit voice recorder provided only limited assistance. Although portions of the recording captured routine flight operations, investigators discovered that the final section, containing the emergency itself, was missing. Because the recorder continuously overwrote older audio, it preserved only the most recent 30 minutes of cockpit conversations. By the time investigators recovered the device, the critical period surrounding the crew's struggle with smoke and fire was no longer available. That missing audio became one of the investigation's greatest frustrations, eliminating what might have been the most direct evidence of the crew's final actions. Official investigators concluded that an uncontrollable fire had developed somewhere within the aircraft, yet identifying exactly how it began proved far more complicated. Their findings indicated that the fire most likely originated in the main deck cargo area before spreading rapidly. However, the precise ignition source could not be conclusively determined. Without identifying the first object to ignite, investigators could explain how the emergency evolved, but not necessarily why it started in the first place. Alternative explanations emerged almost as quickly as the official findings themselves. Questions arose concerning the aircraft's cargo, particularly whether every item loaded aboard had been accurately declared. Reports and later speculation examined the possibility that hazardous materials may have contributed to the fire, though no definitive evidence established a single undisputed cause. Other discussions focused on electrical systems, packaging materials, or interactions between cargo items capable of generating intense heat. Over the years, numerous theories have circulated, but none has displaced the official conclusion that an onboard fire led to the aircraft's loss. The investigation also prompted broader changes throughout commercial aviation. Authorities revisited cargo fire detection systems, fire suppression capabilities, and certification requirements for aircraft carrying freight alongside passengers. Manufacturers and regulators strengthened standards governing cargo compartment protection, reflecting lessons learned from accidents in which fire spread faster than crews could control it. While those changes improved safety for future flights, they did little to resolve the lingering uncertainties surrounding Flight 295 itself. What remains most striking is not simply that a fire occurred, but how many questions survived it. The crew recognized the emergency, communicated professionally, and diverted toward the nearest suitable airport with every intention of landing safely. Investigators recovered wreckage from the ocean floor, analysed structural damage in remarkable detail, and reconstructed much of the aircraft's final journey. Yet one crucial question has resisted complete resolution for decades. What first transformed an ordinary overnight flight into an emergency from which there would be no return? The cockpit of South African Airways. Flight 295 fell silent long before the investigation did, and decades later the search for the fire's true origin continues. The storm they tried to escape. Night has a way of transforming even familiar waters into places where distance, weather, and darkness become almost impossible to separate. From high above, the surface of a large lake can resemble an endless expanse with few visual references, especially when clouds erase the horizon and scattered storms begin to dominate the sky. Long before satellites tracked every thunderstorm in real time or sophisticated weather radar became standard aboard commercial aircraft, pilots crossing such regions relied on forecasts, radio reports, and experience to judge what lay ahead. Most flights passed without incident. Occasionally, however, a storm left behind questions that outlasted the weather itself. Across that vast stretch of Lake Michigan, Northwest Orient Flight 2501 entered the evening expecting little more than another overnight crossing. On June 23, 1950, the Douglas DC-4 departed New York City bound for Minneapolis, carrying 55 passengers and 3 crew members. The route had been flown many times before, connecting major American cities through a network that had grown rapidly during the post-war years. The aircraft had already covered much of its journey before approaching the Great Lakes, where changing weather demanded increasing attention from crews operating through the night. Flying above the Great Lakes during the late 1940s and early 1950s required crews to place enormous trust in forecasts, instruments, and experience rather than technology. Airborne weather radar was still in its infancy, and not yet a standard feature of commercial aviation. Pilots depended largely on reports from meteorologists, observations from other aircraft, and communication with controllers to avoid the most hazardous conditions. Thunderstorms were especially difficult because they could develop, intensify, and shift faster than information reached the cockpit. A route that appeared manageable an hour earlier could become far more dangerous by the time an aircraft arrived. Far ahead of the aircraft, powerful thunderstorms were already beginning to reshape the route waiting in its path. Meteorological records later confirmed that an extensive line of storms stretched across parts of the Midwest that evening, bringing heavy rain, strong winds, and intense turbulence. These were not isolated storm clouds that could easily be circled from a distance. They formed a broad weather system capable of forcing pilots to make difficult decisions while already committed to their routes. Every mile closer to the storms reduced the number of options available. Weather rarely arrives all at once, and the conditions confronting the crew appear to have worsened gradually as the flight continued eastward. Turbulence likely increased as the aircraft approached the storm line, while towering cumulonimbus clouds presented obstacles extending thousands of feet into the atmosphere. Commercial aircraft of the era lacked many of the technological tools available today for detecting the internal structure of storm systems. Even experienced crews could find themselves navigating through rapidly changing conditions where visibility, airflow, and aircraft performance became increasingly unpredictable. Eventually, the pilots made a request that investigators would later examine more closely than any other radio transmission from the flight. As Flight 2501 neared the severe weather over Lake Michigan, the crew requested permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet. Such requests were not uncommon. Pilots often sought smoother air beneath turbulent layers or adjusted altitude to avoid the most unstable portions of a weather system. Nothing about the request itself suggested panic. It reflected a crew actively managing changing conditions using the procedures available to them. Permission to descend never came in the form the crew had hoped for. Air traffic control denied the request because another aircraft was believed to be operating at the lower altitude, creating a potential conflict under the separation standards of the time. Controllers instead instructed Flight 2501 to maintain its assigned altitude. The exchange remained calm and professional. No distress signal followed, no indication that the aircraft had suffered structural damage, and no suggestion that the situation had become uncontrollable within those final moments of communication. Nothing further suggested that the situation aboard had become catastrophic, yet the radio soon fell completely silent. Repeated attempts to establish further contact received no reply. Unlike modern aircraft, which continuously transmit detailed flight information through multiple independent systems, the Douglas DC-4 simply disappeared from communication. The last confirmed clue remained that denied request to descend, a decision that would later become one of the most closely analysed aspects of the entire case. By sunrise, the focus had shifted from guiding an aircraft safely to its destination to searching an enormous body of water for any sign that it had ever been there. The United States Coast Guard, the United States Navy, local authorities and civilian volunteers launched one of the largest search operations conducted on Lake Michigan up to that time. Aircraft flew search patterns across the water, while vessels combed the lake's surface, hoping for survivors or floating wreckage. Instead, they encountered an environment that seemed determined to conceal what had happened during the night. Small pieces of debris began appearing long before investigators knew where the main wreckage had gone. Cushions, fragments of the aircraft's interior, insulation, and human remains were recovered floating on the lake. The discoveries confirmed that Flight 2501 had crashed into Lake Michigan, but they revealed remarkably little about how the accident had unfolded. No large section of fuselage appeared on the surface, and no substantial wreckage field could immediately guide investigators toward the aircraft's resting place beneath the water. Without the aircraft itself, every recovered fragment carried far more importance than its size might suggest. Investigators carefully examined pieces of cabin flooring, structural material, and recovered components for evidence of fire, explosion, or mechanical failure. No conclusive indication emerged that an onboard fire, sabotage, or in-flight explosion had destroyed the aircraft before impact. Instead, the available evidence pointed investigators back toward the severe weather through which the flight had been attempting to navigate. Yet weather alone could not explain every unanswered question. Official investigators pieced together the available evidence while acknowledging how much of the story remained beyond their reach. The Civil Aeronautics Board concluded that the probable cause could not be determined with certainty because the aircraft had never been recovered. The investigation considered whether extraordinary turbulence associated with the thunderstorms may have imposed structural loads beyond the aircraft's design limits or caused the crew to lose control. Both possibilities remained plausible, but neither could be proven without examining the missing wreckage itself. Several explanations have been proposed over the decades, though none can answer every question left behind by the missing aircraft. Some researchers believe violent turbulence may have subjected the DC-4 to stresses that exceeded what it could withstand. Others have suggested that powerful downdrafts associated with thunderstorms could have forced the aircraft into an unrecoverable descent. Additional theories have considered icing, instrument limitations, or a combination of weather-related factors rather than a single catastrophic event. Each explanation draws support from known aviation hazards, yet each ultimately encounters the same obstacle: the absence of the aircraft. The mystery deepened because Lake Michigan has preserved many historic shipwrecks and aircraft beneath remarkably cold freshwater conditions. Unlike salt water, which accelerates corrosion, the lake has the potential to preserve wreckage for generations. That possibility encouraged repeated efforts to relocate Flight 2501 using advancing sonar technology. If the aircraft could finally be found, investigators hoped it might answer questions that documents and eyewitness accounts never could. Modern technology has returned researchers to Lake Michigan more than once, in hopes of finding what earlier generations could not. Sonar surveys have identified numerous underwater targets across the lake bed, some initially raising hopes that the long-lost aircraft had finally been located. Several discoveries proved to be unrelated wrecks or natural formations, while other areas remained difficult to investigate because of depth, sediment, and the sheer scale of the search area. Despite decades of effort, the main wreckage of Flight 2501 has never been conclusively identified. That continuing absence has preserved the mystery in an unusual way. Unlike accidents where investigators reconstruct nearly every second from flight recorders and recovered wreckage, Northwest Orient Flight 2501 exists largely through radio communications, weather records, recovered debris, and careful analysis. The crew's final request for a lower altitude remains more than just a routine exchange with air traffic control. It represents the last clear indication of what the pilots believed might improve their chances before the aircraft disappeared into conditions no one on the ground could fully observe. More than 70 years later, the storm has long since passed, but the uncertainty surrounding that flight has never completely cleared. Advances in meteorology have improved understanding of severe thunderstorms, while modern aircraft carry technology that crews in 1950 could scarcely have imagined. Yet those improvements cannot rewrite the final minutes of Flight 2501. The weather system eventually dissipated, the radio frequencies fell quiet, and Lake Michigan resumed its familiar appearance, concealing whatever remained below its surface. Lake Michigan continues to guard the missing heart of Northwest Orient Flight 2501, leaving its final request suspended between history and unanswered possibility. A routine flight into oblivion. Not every aviation mystery begins with a warning, because some begin with the quiet expectation that another routine report is only minutes away. Commercial flights crossing the Atlantic have long depended on scheduled position reports to reassure controllers that everything is unfolding exactly as planned. Each transmission confirms that an aircraft has reached another invisible checkpoint over an ocean where there are few landmarks and even fewer witnesses. Most of those reports disappear into the routine of aviation history, remembered only in technical records before the next message arrives. Occasionally, however, a perfectly ordinary transmission becomes extraordinary for one unsettling reason. It is the last one anyone will ever hear. Early in 1948, British South American Airways Flight Star Tiger departed on a journey that had already been completed successfully by other crews. The Avro Tudor 4 airliner was operating a scheduled passenger service from Santa Maria in the Azores to Bermuda, carrying 25 passengers and 6 crew members across a vast stretch of the North Atlantic. British South American Airways had established itself as one of Britain's principal international airlines following the Second World War, serving routes that linked Europe with destinations across the Atlantic and South America. Although ocean crossings still demanded careful planning and experienced crews, they were steadily becoming a normal part of international air travel. Post-war commercial aviation was expanding rapidly across the Atlantic, connecting distant destinations that only a few years earlier had seemed far less accessible. Aircraft technology had advanced considerably during the war, allowing civilian operators to fly farther than ever before, yet long-distance navigation remained fundamentally different from today's satellite-guided flights. Pilots relied on celestial navigation when conditions permitted, radio beacons near land, compass headings, and carefully calculated estimates of wind speed and drift. Every position report represented the crew's best assessment of where the aircraft should be over an ocean that offered no visible reference points. The Avro Tudor 4 reflected the ambitions of Britain's growing civil aviation industry. Developed from wartime bomber technology but redesigned for commercial service, the aircraft promised long-range capability suitable for international routes. While later years would bring scrutiny to aspects of the Tudor's operational history, the aircraft assigned to Star Tiger had departed with no indication that it faced an immediate mechanical crisis. To those aboard, the flight represented another overnight crossing rather than the beginning of an enduring aviation mystery. Conditions along much of the route appeared manageable, even though flying across open ocean always demanded careful navigation and constant attention. Weather forecasts acknowledged the presence of strong headwinds, a factor capable of slowing an aircraft's progress and increasing fuel consumption. But such conditions were not uncommon over the North Atlantic during winter. Captain David Colby and his crew adjusted their flight profile accordingly, choosing to cruise at a relatively low altitude in part because stronger winds were forecast higher above the ocean. The decision reflected practical fuel management rather than evidence of an emergency. Operating at lower altitude came with its own compromises. Denser air generally increased fuel consumption compared with higher cruising levels, yet avoiding stronger headwinds could offset some of that penalty. Throughout the flight, the crew remained in communication with ground stations responsible for tracking transatlantic traffic. Each report indicated that the aircraft continued westward as expected, and nothing in those exchanges suggested that the flight had become unstable or that the crew was struggling with an unforeseen problem. As the aircraft continued westward, its crew maintained the steady pattern of communication expected during transatlantic operations. Unlike flights over populated land, aircraft crossing the Atlantic were separated by immense distances, making periodic position reports essential. Controllers depended on those scheduled communications not only to estimate arrival times, but also to maintain awareness of aircraft operating far beyond radar coverage. Missing even a single report could significantly complicate efforts to determine an aircraft's last known position. Eventually, one routine position report became the final confirmed transmission anyone would ever receive from the flight. The communication itself contained nothing dramatic. There was no indication of mechanical failure, no report of severe turbulence, no request for emergency assistance, and no suggestion that the aircraft required immediate help. The crew simply provided the information expected of them while continuing toward Bermuda. It sounded like countless other routine reports exchanged over the Atlantic before and since. Ground stations simply waited for the next scheduled contact, unaware that the silence already carried far greater significance than the message that had preceded it. At first, there was little reason for alarm. Delays in radio communication occasionally occurred because of atmospheric conditions or equipment limitations. Controllers attempted to establish contact again, assuming the aircraft might simply be experiencing temporary radio interference. Minutes gradually became longer than expected, and routine patience slowly gave way to growing concern. Repeated calls into the Atlantic produced nothing except unanswered frequencies and growing uncertainty. Other aircraft operating in the region also attempted to contact Star Tiger, but no reply came from the missing airliner. The absence of a distress signal proved especially troubling. Pilots confronted with emergencies generally attempted to communicate whenever circumstances allowed, even if only briefly. Star Tiger offered no such indication. Its final routine report became the last confirmed evidence that the aircraft had continued its journey normally. Search aircraft and ships soon spread across thousands of square miles, where almost every visible clue seemed to vanish as quickly as it might appear. Naval vessels altered course, aircraft searched enormous sectors of ocean, and rescue teams looked for survivors, floating wreckage, fuel slicks, or emergency equipment. The search extended over several days despite difficult weather and the sheer size of the potential search area. Every hour reduced the likelihood of finding survivors, while increasing the mystery surrounding the disappearance. Remarkably little physical evidence emerged despite an extensive search involving both air and sea. No confirmed wreckage was recovered. No floating debris could be conclusively linked to the aircraft. No life rafts or emergency equipment were located, and no verified distress transmissions surfaced after the final position report. Unlike many aviation accidents where investigators eventually reconstruct events through recovered wreckage, Star Tiger left almost nothing behind from which a definitive sequence could be established. Without wreckage to examine, investigators were forced to reconstruct the flight using reports recorded before communication ended. Fuel calculations, navigation procedures, meteorological data, aircraft performance, maintenance records, and witness statements all became essential pieces of a puzzle, missing its largest component. Investigators explored whether strong headwinds had affected fuel reserves more severely than anticipated, whether navigational errors accumulated during the crossing, or whether an undetected mechanical failure developed beyond the crew's ability to report. Each possibility possessed elements of plausibility, yet none could be demonstrated conclusively. Official findings considered weather, navigation, aircraft performance, and operational decisions without identifying a definitive cause for the disappearance. The official investigation concluded that there was insufficient evidence to determine what had happened after the aircraft's final transmission. That conclusion reflected not a lack of effort, but a lack of physical evidence. Without the aircraft, investigators could not confirm whether structural failure, engine problems, navigational error, weather, or another factor had ultimately brought the flight down. Over the years, more imaginative explanations gradually entered public discussion, though they consistently reached beyond what the available evidence could support. Because Star Tiger disappeared in a region later associated with the Bermuda Triangle, the flight became intertwined with stories involving unexplained vanishings, magnetic anomalies, and other extraordinary claims. These ideas captured public imagination, yet official investigations found no evidence requiring supernatural or unconventional explanations. The enduring mystery existed not because investigators ignored obvious answers, but because essential evidence had never been found. Perhaps the greatest challenge has always been separating the facts preserved in official records from the legends that later surrounded the flight. The historical record documents a routine departure, experienced crew, ordinary communications, difficult but not unprecedented weather, an expected sequence of position reports, and then silence. Everything beyond that point enters a realm of uncertainty shaped by missing evidence rather than confirmed events. The lack of answers created space for speculation, but speculation has never replaced documentation. Nearly every unanswered question surrounding the disappearance traces back to how completely ordinary the journey appeared before contact was lost. There was no famous final phrase remembered by generations, no cryptic message inviting endless interpretation, and no recorded emergency revealing a desperate struggle inside the cockpit. Instead, the mystery rests upon the unsettling reality that an aircraft can move from routine operation to complete disappearance without leaving behind any clear indication that circumstances had changed at all. In many ways, that absence of warning has become the defining feature of StarTiger's story, reminding investigators that silence itself can become one of aviation's most enduring clues. British South American Airways StarTiger was never remembered for the message its crew transmitted, but for the routine report the world expected to hear next and never did. The voice that never returned. Every long-distance flight depends on a chain of voices, each one guiding an aircraft only until it is time for someone else to take over. Pilots spend much of an international journey moving from one radio frequency to another, acknowledging instructions from one controller before checking in with the next as they cross invisible boundaries drawn across oceans and continents. The process is so ordinary that it rarely attracts attention outside the cockpit, and when everything goes as planned, those brief exchanges are forgotten almost as quickly as they are spoken. Yet one of aviation's oldest disappearance mysteries began during precisely such a routine transition, when an expected conversation never took place. On the morning of January 17, 1949, British South American Airways star Ariel departed Bermuda for Kingston, Jamaica, on what appeared to be an exceptionally favourable day for flying. The aircraft, an Avro Tudor VB, carried 13 passengers and 7 crew members on a scheduled international service across the Caribbean. Unlike many disappearances later associated with violent weather or obvious emergencies, this flight began under conditions that investigators would repeatedly describe as remarkably good. Visibility was excellent, clouds were minimal, and no significant storms threatened the planned route. Bright skies, good visibility, and relatively calm weather offered few reasons to expect the journey would become one of aviation's enduring mysteries. Pilots crossing the Caribbean always remained alert to changing conditions, but nothing in the available forecasts suggested that Star Ariel would encounter weather capable of placing the aircraft in immediate danger. The favourable atmosphere would later become one of the investigation's greatest frustrations because it removed one of the most common explanations for aircraft disappearing over open water. Operating an Avro Tudor IVB across the Caribbean still required disciplined navigation, but nothing reported during the early stages of the flight suggested unusual difficulty. The Tudor series had experienced operational challenges during its service history, and earlier accidents had already drawn attention to aspects of the aircraft's design and reliability. Even so, no evidence indicated that Star Ariel departed Bermuda with a known mechanical problem capable of explaining its eventual disappearance. Maintenance records available to investigators revealed no defect that clearly foreshadowed what was about to happen. Communication with ground stations continued exactly as controllers anticipated throughout the flight's initial progress. During long-distance operations over water, crews routinely transmitted position reports and operational updates, while maintaining contact with the stations responsible for their section of airspace. These exchanges served as confirmation that navigation continued normally, and that the aircraft remained on its intended route. Every report received from Star Ariel suggested that the flight was progressing without incident. Attention later focused on one routine exchange that seemed too ordinary to deserve notice at the time. Captain John McPhee reported the aircraft's position and advised that Star Ariel would be changing to another radio frequency for continued communication as the flight progressed toward Jamaica. Nothing in the transmission hinted at uncertainty, urgency, or mechanical difficulty. The conversation reflected exactly the sort of professional exchange heard countless times each day between flight crews and controllers responsible for handing aircraft from one communication sector to the next. Changing from one radio frequency to another was among the simplest procedures a flight crew performed during any international journey. Once a controller instructed an aircraft to contact the next station, the crew acknowledged the instruction, adjusted the radio equipment, and established communication on the assigned frequency. The process usually lasted only moments. Controllers expected the next station to hear the aircraft shortly afterward, while the previous station turned its attention to other flights continuing through its area of responsibility. Because the procedure was so routine, a brief delay in making contact rarely caused immediate alarm. Instead of checking in with the next controller, the aircraft simply never spoke again. No further position reports were received, no request for assistance interrupted the silence, and no distress call indicated that the crew had encountered an emergency while changing frequencies. The absence of communication became the defining feature of the case. Star Aerial did not disappear after a dramatic final transmission or a desperate mayday. It disappeared between one ordinary conversation and the next. Concern developed gradually because there was no obvious reason to assume anything more serious than a delayed transmission. Radio propagation over long distances could be unpredictable. Atmospheric conditions occasionally interfered with reception, and communication delays were not entirely unknown during that period. Ground stations continued attempting to establish contact, while assuming the aircraft might still respond once radio conditions improved. As additional minutes passed without success, that cautious optimism slowly gave way to growing concern. Extensive search efforts soon covered sea and sky without discovering a single, confirmed trace of the missing aircraft. Aircraft from both military and civilian organizations searched the Caribbean along the aircraft's projected route, while ships examined surrounding waters for survivors, wreckage, life rafts, or floating debris. Favorable weather, which had initially appeared to improve the aircraft's chances of completing its journey safely, now seemed equally favorable for locating evidence if an accident had occurred. Yet despite extensive operations, search teams found nothing that could be conclusively linked to Star Aerial. Investigators quickly discovered that the absence of evidence would become the greatest obstacle to understanding what had happened. Without wreckage, flight recorders, or eyewitness accounts from the aircraft's final moments, every reconstruction depended on the information available before communication ended. Unlike accidents where damaged components reveal structural failure, or cockpit recordings document the crew's actions, Star Aerial offered investigators almost no physical clues from which to begin. Unlike several other disappearances of the era, this case offered neither severe weather nor confirmed mechanical trouble as an obvious starting point. Meteorological analysis found no evidence that the aircraft had flown into a major storm system. No verified radio message reported engine failure, onboard fire, structural damage, or navigational confusion. Fuel calculations, flight planning, and the crew's experience all received careful examination, yet none produced a definitive explanation capable of accounting for the aircraft's complete disappearance. Comparisons with the earlier loss of Star Tiger emerged naturally, yet the similarities only deepened the uncertainty surrounding both flights. Less than a year earlier, another British South American Airways Avro Tudor had disappeared over the Atlantic after routine communications. Investigators considered whether the two accidents shared a common cause, particularly because they involved related aircraft operated by the same airline. However, important differences complicated those comparisons. Star Tiger had encountered less favourable weather and operated under different flight conditions, whereas Star Aerial disappeared despite conditions generally considered excellent for flying. The resemblance between the two cases raised questions but failed to provide convincing answers. Decades of discussion have produced numerous possibilities, but remarkably few conclusions capable of surviving careful examination. Some researchers have explored the possibility of catastrophic mechanical failure occurring too suddenly for the crew to transmit a distress message. Others have examined navigational error, structural failure, or an event that rendered communication impossible within seconds. As with many disappearances lacking substantial physical evidence, more speculative explanations eventually emerged, particularly after both Star Tiger and Star Aerial became associated in popular culture with the Bermuda Triangle. Official investigations, however, never identified evidence requiring extraordinary explanations beyond the limits of documented fact. The disappearance also highlighted the limitations of aviation technology during the late 1940s. Continuous radar coverage over remote oceanic regions did not exist. Aircraft carried no satellite tracking equipment, and cockpit voice or flight data recorders had not yet become standard. Once communication ceased, investigators possessed little more than the aircraft's last reported position, estimated flight path, and the expectation that another radio call should have followed. that technological reality transformed what might otherwise have been an ordinary accident investigation into a mystery defined by absence. What ultimately endured was the realization that the final confirmed moments of the flight appeared almost perfectly ordinary. The crew completed their responsibilities, communicated professionally, acknowledged the procedures expected of them, and prepared to continue the journey exactly as countless crews had done before. Nothing in the available record clearly marks the instant when routine became an irreversible mystery. Instead, the transition seems to occur almost invisibly, hidden somewhere between one completed radio exchange and another that history never recorded. From that ordinary change of frequency onward, every confirmed fact about Star Ariel gave way to unanswered silence, searching for a runway that never appeared. Scattered across the central Pacific lies a coral island so small that from thousands of feet above, it could disappear into the horizon long before a pilot realized it had been missed. Measuring little more than a narrow strip of land surrounded by an immense ocean, Howland Island offered almost no margin for navigational error. Unlike an airport near a city or a coastline visible from dozens of miles away, this isolated destination waited alone in a sea stretching for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Reaching it demanded precision, patience, and a sequence of successful calculations that left little room for uncertainty. Few places on Earth have demonstrated more clearly how vast an ocean can become when the destination is almost invisible. Toward that isolated destination, Amelia Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan began one of the most demanding legs of their attempt to fly around the world. By July 1937, Earhart had already established herself as one of the most celebrated aviators of her era, breaking records and challenging assumptions about who belonged in the cockpit of long-distance aircraft. Accompanying her was Fred Noonan, an experienced navigator whose background in oceanic navigation made him a valuable partner for a journey that depended as much on finding remote islands as it did on flying between them. Their aircraft, a Lockheed Model 10E Electra specially modified for extended range, had already completed much of the ambitious expedition. Ahead lay one of its most difficult stages, the flight from Lae, New Guinea, to Howland Island. Finding Howland Island depended far less on luck than on precise navigation, carried out over an ocean offering almost no visual reference points. During the 1930s, long-range flights relied upon techniques that demanded constant calculation. Dead reckoning combined an aircraft's heading, airspeed, estimated wind conditions, and elapsed time to estimate position. Celestial navigation could refine those estimates when weather permitted observations of the sun or stars. Radio direction finding also promised valuable assistance, but it required effective communication between aircraft and ground stations. Every element needed to function together because a small navigational error, insignificant over a short distance, could become hundreds of kilometers by the end of a transoceanic flight. Hour after hour, the Lockheed Electra continued across open water, where every mile looked remarkably similar to the one before it. Unlike pilots crossing continents, Earhart and Noonan could not rely on rivers, mountains, roads, or settlements to confirm their progress. Beneath them stretched an uninterrupted Pacific, while above them the changing position of the sun and shifting cloud layers offered only limited reassurance. The further they travelled from New Guinea, the fewer opportunities remained to verify their exact location. Every calculation became increasingly important because there would be no second chance to locate such a small island after passing beyond it. Aboard the nearby United States Coast Guard cutter Itasca, crews prepared to guide the aircraft through the final stage of its approach. The vessel had been stationed off Howland Island specifically to assist Earhart's arrival, maintaining radio communications and producing smoke from its boilers to increase its visibility. Personnel aboard Itasca understood the significance of the flight and remained alert for any indication that the Electra was approaching. They expected to hear increasingly frequent communications as the aircraft closed the remaining distance to the island. Radio transmissions soon revealed that locating the island was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Earhart reported receiving signals but indicated varying degrees of difficulty in determining their direction. Communication between the aircraft and Itasca became increasingly complicated by differences in radio procedures and technical limitations affecting both transmission and reception. Historians continue to examine these exchanges carefully because they offer one of the few direct windows into the crew's final hours. Rather than suggesting immediate catastrophe, the transmissions reveal an aircraft still actively searching for its destination. As time passed, the conversation gradually shifted away from routine position updates and toward navigation itself. Earhart reported flying at an altitude intended to improve visibility, while continuing to search for the island below. She also indicated difficulty receiving signals clearly enough to obtain reliable bearings. The problem was not simply hearing another station. Successful radio direction finding required specific procedures, compatible equipment, and favourable conditions. Small misunderstandings or technical limitations could undermine attempts to determine the aircraft's exact relationship to the island, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. With fuel becoming an increasingly important concern, each new message carried greater urgency than the last. Long-distance flights always balanced distance, consumption, and reserve fuel carefully, and every additional minute spent searching reduced the options available afterward. Yet the recorded transmissions still reflected a crew working methodically through a navigational problem rather than reacting to a sudden emergency. Earhart continued communicating her situation, while Noonan almost certainly continued refining calculations intended to bring them closer to Howland Island. One transmission in particular would become among the most studied in aviation history. Earhart reported, "We're on the line 157-337, running north and south." The statement referred to a navigational line of position derived from celestial observations. Rather than identifying a single location, such a line indicated that the aircraft could be anywhere along it. The logical response was to search along that line in hopes of intersecting the island. Those words became the final confirmed radio message received from the Electra. After those final words, every attempt to answer the aircraft received only unanswered radio frequencies. The crew aboard Itasca continued transmitting, hoping Earhart would hear their signals or respond with updated information. Additional efforts were made to establish communication using different procedures, but none succeeded. The radio frequencies that had carried increasingly urgent discussions about navigation now produced only silence. Whether the aircraft remained airborne beyond that point, changed course, or exhausted its fuel could no longer be confirmed through direct communication. What followed became the largest and most expensive search operation the United States had ever conducted for a missing aircraft at that time. The US Navy and Coast Guard committed ships, aircraft, personnel, and significant resources to searching vast areas of the Central Pacific. Search crews examined waters surrounding Howland Island, as well as regions lying along possible alternate flight paths. Despite the unprecedented scale of the effort, the Pacific offered few clues capable of narrowing the search. The ocean that had complicated navigation now complicated rescue in equal measure. Despite the extraordinary scale of the effort, investigators recovered no confirmed wreckage capable of explaining the disappearance. Without debris, flight recorders, or verified eyewitness accounts, reconstructing the aircraft's final moments became extraordinarily difficult. The investigation therefore relied heavily upon navigation records, radio logs, fuel estimates, weather information, and the sequence of Earhart's recorded transmissions. Each piece of evidence helped define the problem more clearly, while stopping short of providing a definitive answer. Several explanations have competed for attention ever since, each attempting to account for the aircraft's final position, using the limited evidence that survives. The most widely accepted hypothesis proposes that the Electra failed to locate Howland Island, exhausted its fuel while searching, and ultimately came down in the Pacific Ocean. Another long-discussed theory suggests that Earhart and Noonan may have reached Nikumaroro, formerly known as Gardner Island, where they could have landed on a reef before later succumbing to isolation. Expeditions and research associated with that hypothesis have recovered artifacts considered intriguing by some researchers, yet no discovery has produced universal agreement that the aircraft reached the island. Other theories have emerged over the decades, but few rest upon evidence as substantial as the documented navigation and communication records. Modern expeditions have repeatedly returned to the Central Pacific, hoping that advances in technology might succeed where earlier searches could not. Deep-sea sonar, remotely operated vehicles, improved mapping techniques, and renewed historical analysis have all contributed fresh perspectives to the search. Despite these advances, the vastness of the Pacific continues to challenge investigators. The ocean floor surrounding Howland Island reaches extraordinary depths, while decades of shifting assumptions have expanded the possible search area far beyond what anyone imagined in 1937. Whether the aircraft exhausted its fuel near Howland Island or reached another destination remains one of aviation's longest-running debates. Yet beneath every theory lies the same undeniable reality. Earhart's final radio calls were not describing mechanical failure or an aircraft falling apart in flight. They described experienced aviators searching for a destination they believed they were close to reaching. The irony has remained remarkably persistent through generations of investigation. One of the world's most famous disappearances unfolded not because the crew lost sight of where they had come from, but because they could no longer find where they were trying to go. Decades of investigation have transformed a tiny island into one of the world's most recognizable symbols of an unanswered journey. Countless aircraft have landed safely on remote runways since Earhart's final flight, guided by technologies unavailable to her generation. Yet Howland Island continues to occupy a singular place in aviation history because it represents a destination whose significance grew immeasurably after it was missed. The search for the Electra has expanded across oceans and generations, but the final approach remains incomplete. The last confirmed transmission from Amelia Earhart pointed toward a line across the Pacific, but where that line finally ended remains one of aviation's greatest unanswered questions. Lost above the Andes, towering mountain ranges can disappear behind clouds so completely that pilots may see empty sky where enormous peaks still stand. Unlike coastlines or broad plains, high mountain corridors constantly reshape a crew's perception of distance, altitude, and position, especially when visibility narrows and familiar landmarks vanish beneath layers of cloud. Even experienced aviators understand that the greatest challenge is not simply avoiding the terrain they can see, but accurately judging the terrain they cannot. Few places illustrate that reality more dramatically than the Andes, where a single navigational misjudgment can remain invisible until there is almost no time left to correct it. Carrying a charter group from Uruguay to Chile, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 approached the Andes with a crew accustomed to operating in demanding conditions. On October 13, 1972, the Fairchild FH-227D departed Mendoza, Argentina, after weather delays had interrupted the previous day's journey from Montevideo. On board were 40 passengers and 5 crew members, including members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, along with family members, supporters, and other travellers bound for Santiago. The crossing of the Andes represented the final major obstacle before reaching Chile, a route flown regularly but never treated casually by crews familiar with the region's complex terrain. Crossing the Andes demanded careful timing because terrain often dictated the route as much as navigation itself. Aircraft did not simply fly directly over the highest peaks. Instead, crews followed established airways and mountain passes while estimating their progress through a combination of navigation instruments, elapsed time, wind calculations, and radio communication. Modern satellite navigation did not yet exist, and position estimates depended heavily upon accurate assumptions about ground speed and wind. A relatively small error accumulated over the course of a mountain crossing could place an aircraft many kilometers from where its crew believed it to be. The route towards Santiago required the crew to pass important navigation points before beginning their descent into Chile. One of those reference points was the vicinity of Curicó, west of the highest portion of the Andes. Reaching that area indicated that the most hazardous terrain had largely been left behind, allowing aircraft to descend toward lower altitudes with greater confidence. The decision to leave cruising altitude therefore depended not merely upon altitude itself, but upon certainty regarding the aircraft's position relative to the mountains. Cloud layers and limited visibility steadily reduced the number of visual references available inside the mountain corridor. Rather than confirming their exact location by sight, the crew increasingly relied upon calculations that estimated how far the aircraft had travelled since leaving earlier checkpoints. Investigators later concluded that stronger than expected headwinds likely reduced the aircraft's ground speed, meaning the Fairchild covered less distance than the crew believed during the time available. To those inside the cockpit, however, the calculations appeared consistent with a flight nearing the western side of the Andes. Based on their calculations, the crew concluded they had progressed far enough to begin the next stage of the descent. They reported to Santiago Air Traffic Control that they believed they had reached the vicinity of Curacao and requested clearance to continue descending. From the information available to controllers, the request appeared entirely reasonable. Air traffic control depended upon position reports provided by flight crews because continuous radar surveillance over the mountainous region was not available. Accepting the reported position, controllers authorized the descent towards Santiago. Air traffic control accepted the reported position and cleared the aircraft to continue as requested. Nothing about the exchange suggested confusion or disagreement. The conversation reflected the ordinary professionalism expected between pilots and controllers coordinating an arrival through mountainous airspace. Neither side possessed immediate evidence that the aircraft remained farther east than everyone believed. In retrospect, the transmission became significant not because of unusual wording, but because it documented the moment when two separate parties unknowingly shared the same incorrect assumption. Only later would investigators understand how critical that shared assumption had become. As the aircraft descended through cloud, the mountains did not disappear behind it as expected. Instead, they remained directly ahead, concealed by weather and distance. The Fairchild continued losing altitude toward terrain that should already have been safely behind the flight path if the reported position had been accurate. Every minute reinforced the crew's confidence that they were approaching open airspace, while in reality they were moving deeper into one of the most unforgiving sections of the Andes. Final radio communications reflected a crew managing what appeared to be a routine transition through the mountains rather than an unfolding disaster. There was no prolonged exchange describing mechanical failure or onboard emergency. The communications instead centered on navigation and descent, consistent with an aircraft preparing for arrival. Investigators later recognized that these final transmissions sounded remarkably calm because the crew had not yet realized the full extent of the danger developing ahead of them. Within moments, the cockpit view changed dramatically. Emerging through breaks in the cloud, the crew suddenly encountered steep mountain slopes much closer than expected. Immediate evasive action followed as the pilots attempted to climb and avoid the terrain. The Fairchild narrowly cleared one ridge before striking another. The impact tore away portions of the aircraft as it continued across the mountainside before the remaining fuselage eventually came to rest on a remote glacier high in the Andes. The radio fell silent almost as suddenly as the mountains had appeared. Search aircraft combed enormous sections of the Andes while the wreckage remained concealed among snow, rock and ice. Rescue crews expected to locate the aircraft quickly, yet the white fuselage blended remarkably well with the surrounding snowfields. Cloud cover, changing weather, and the sheer scale of the mountain range complicated aerial searches, while narrow valleys and towering peaks limited visibility from above. Despite repeated search flights, the crash site remained hidden from those looking directly toward it. From the perspective of rescuers, the mountain range offered countless places where an aircraft could disappear almost completely. As days passed without success, hopes of finding survivors steadily diminished. Search operations eventually ended under the assumption that no one could have survived the impact or the freezing conditions at such altitude. Unknown to the outside world, however, several survivors remained alive among the wreckage, isolated by geography and weather in a place where rescue aircraft repeatedly passed without seeing them. Their remarkable struggle belongs to another chapter of aviation history. For investigators at the time, Flight 571 had effectively vanished. Official investigators reconstructed the flight using navigation records, radio communications, meteorological data, and evidence recovered from the crash site. Their analysis concluded that the crew had begun descending before clearing the Andes because they believed they had already passed the critical navigation point near Curacao. Stronger than anticipated headwinds had reduced the aircraft's progress, causing elapsed time to become an unreliable indicator of position. The descent itself followed standard procedures based upon the reported location, but the reported location proved incorrect. Their findings pointed toward a navigational misjudgment rather than mechanical failure or deliberate action by the crew. Investigators found no evidence that engine malfunction, structural failure, or sabotage had initiated the accident. Instead, the tragedy emerged from a combination of environmental conditions, limited navigation technology, wind effects, and the understandable confidence placed in calculations that unfortunately did not match the aircraft's true position. The accident reinforced the importance of continuously verifying location whenever terrain leaves little margin for error. Modern aviation has since adopted technologies that dramatically reduce the likelihood of repeating the same sequence of events. Satellite navigation, terrain awareness and warning systems, enhanced ground proximity alerts, and improved weather information now provide flight crews with layers of protection unavailable in 1972. These advances cannot erase the accident, but they illustrate how lessons drawn from investigations continue shaping safer aviation practices for future generations. Listening to the final radio exchanges today reveals how ordinary they sounded despite how little they reflected the aircraft's true position. The crew communicated professionally, requested descent in accordance with the information they believed was accurate, and received authorization based upon that same understanding. Nothing within those calm exchanges hinted that the mountains remained directly ahead rather than safely behind. The final messages have therefore come to represent not panic or confusion, but the fragile dependence of aviation upon knowing exactly where an aircraft is at every moment. The last transmissions from Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 carried the confidence of a crew looking beyond the Andes, while the mountains were still waiting directly ahead. Confusion at 35,000 feet. Modern airliners spend much of every flight guided by instruments that pilots have learned to trust with remarkable confidence. Altitude, airspeed, attitude, and countless other measurements are presented continuously, allowing crews to make decisions based on precise information rather than instinct alone. Most of the time, those systems agree with one another so consistently that pilots rarely have reason to question them. Yet commercial aviation has also learned that when a handful of critical indications suddenly become unreliable, the challenge is no longer controlling the aircraft alone. It becomes determining which information still deserves to be believed. Departing Rio de Janeiro for Paris, Air France Flight 447 climbed into the night carrying 216 passengers and 12 crew members across one of the world's busiest oceanic routes. On June 1, 2009, the Airbus A330-203 left Galeão International Airport for an overnight flight to Charles de Gaulle Airport, following a route that crossed the equatorial Atlantic before continuing toward Europe. Long-haul flights like this occurred every day, and the Airbus A330 had established a reputation as a modern aircraft, equipped with sophisticated flight control systems designed to assist crews through demanding conditions. Nothing about the departure suggested that the flight would become one of the most extensively studied accidents in aviation history. Cruising high above the Atlantic, the aircraft encountered weather that crews crossing the intertropical convergence zone routinely expected to navigate. This region, where warm air masses converge near the equator, frequently produces towering thunderstorms, heavy precipitation, and areas of strong atmospheric instability. Commercial aircraft regularly avoid the most intense storm cells by making modest route adjustments while remaining at cruising altitude. Flight 447's crew monitored weather displays and altered course slightly to steer around the most severe activity, following procedures familiar to airline pilots operating over tropical oceans. The captain remained in the cockpit during the early portion of the crossing, before leaving for a scheduled rest period, a routine practice on long-haul flights with augmented crews. Two first officers continued monitoring the aircraft while it proceeded through the night. The autopilot remained engaged, engines operated normally, and communications with air traffic control reflected an aircraft progressing as expected across oceanic airspace. From the perspective of everyone outside the cockpit, Flight 447 remained another routine crossing over the Atlantic. Small ice crystals soon interfered with equipment whose accuracy rarely attracted attention during ordinary flights. The aircraft entered an area containing high-altitude ice crystals capable of temporarily obstructing the pitot tubes, small sensors mounted on the aircraft's exterior that measure airspeed by comparing air pressure. If those sensors become blocked or provide inconsistent information, the aircraft's computers may no longer receive reliable airspeed data. Such events are generally brief, but because airspeed influences numerous flight systems, even a temporary interruption can trigger a series of automatic responses designed to protect the aircraft. Automatic flight systems responded exactly as they had been designed to respond when reliable airspeed information could no longer be confirmed. As conflicting airspeed values appeared, the autopilot and autothrust disconnected automatically, transferring direct responsibility for controlling the aircraft back to the pilots. At the same time, certain flight envelope protections available under normal operating conditions became unavailable because the computers could no longer determine the aircraft's performance with sufficient confidence. None of these responses represented a mechanical failure in themselves. Instead, they reflected the aircraft acknowledging uncertainty about one of its most important sources of information. Manual control returned to the cockpit at precisely the moment certainty began slipping away. The sudden change required the pilots to transition immediately from supervising automated systems to actively flying an aircraft in darkness above the ocean while passing near convective weather. The available evidence later showed that the pilot flying responded by applying nose-up control inputs, causing the aircraft to begin climbing. As altitude increased, airspeed decreased further, gradually placing the aircraft into an aerodynamic condition from which recovery would become increasingly difficult. Warnings, instrument indications, and crew observations no longer formed the clear picture pilots depend upon during critical decisions. Stall warnings activated, ceased, and activated again as changing airspeed calculations affected the warning logic. Altitude continued increasing briefly before the aircraft lost lift and entered a deep aerodynamic stall. Although the aircraft remained structurally intact and its engines continued operating, its attitude, vertical speed, and changing instrument indications created a situation that proved remarkably difficult to interpret in real time. Investigators later concluded that the crew never fully recognized that the aircraft had entered a sustained stall. Recorded cockpit conversations captured experienced aviators trying to understand a situation that was changing faster than they could fully interpret it. The cockpit voice recorder preserved questions, observations, and attempts to identify the source of conflicting indications while the crew worked together to regain control. As the captain returned to the flight deck, he encountered a situation that had evolved significantly during his absence. Information continued flowing into the cockpit, yet assembling those pieces into a correct understanding of the aircraft's condition became increasingly challenging. The difficulty lay not in a complete absence of information, but in determining which indications most accurately reflected reality. Meanwhile, automated ACARS messages quietly transmitted technical information to Air France maintenance systems without revealing the full human struggle unfolding aboard the aircraft. During the final minutes of the flight, a series of automated maintenance messages reported failures, system disconnects, and degraded operating modes generated as different aircraft systems responded to the changing conditions. These messages reached the airline automatically, but viewed individually they described technical symptoms rather than a complete explanation. Only after investigators reconstructed the sequence of events did those transmissions reveal how rapidly multiple systems had reacted to the initial loss of reliable airspeed information. Contact with the flight ended over the Atlantic before anyone outside the cockpit understood the significance of those final minutes. Air traffic control expected routine communication as the aircraft continued toward the next reporting point, while airline personnel initially interpreted the automated maintenance messages as isolated technical events rather than evidence of an unfolding disaster. Only when Flight 447 failed to establish subsequent contact did concern escalate into an international search effort, spanning a vast section of the Atlantic Ocean. An extensive international search eventually shifted from locating survivors to locating the aircraft itself. Search aircraft, naval vessels, and satellite resources examined enormous areas of ocean, eventually recovering floating debris and confirming that the aircraft had entered the sea. Yet locating the main wreckage proved far more difficult. The Atlantic in that region reaches extraordinary depths, and powerful currents complicated efforts to determine where the aircraft had come to rest. For nearly 2 years, investigators possessed important fragments of evidence, but lacked the information needed to explain the crew's final decisions. Recovering the flight recorders transformed the investigation from speculation into one of the most detailed reconstructions in aviation history. In 2011, search teams located the wreckage on the ocean floor and recovered both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Together, they documented almost every significant event during the aircraft's final minutes, allowing investigators to compare technical data with cockpit conversations in remarkable detail. Unlike many aviation mysteries where missing evidence leaves major questions unresolved, Flight 447 gradually became one of the best documented accidents ever investigated. Investigators concluded that no single failure fully explained the accident, pointing instead to a sequence of technical and human factors that reinforced one another. Temporary obstruction of the pitot tubes initiated the chain of events by producing unreliable airspeed information, but the accident itself resulted from the crew's responses after automation disengaged. The aircraft remained flyable, yet inappropriate control inputs, difficulty recognizing the aerodynamic stall, workload, nighttime conditions, and the complexity of the situation combined to prevent recovery. Rather than identifying one decisive mistake, the investigation demonstrated how several individually understandable events aligned to produce a catastrophic outcome. Changes introduced after the investigation reshaped pilot training, aircraft equipment, and the industry's understanding of high-altitude upsets. Airlines expanded their emphasis on manual aircraft handling at cruising altitude, stall recognition, and recovery techniques during unreliable airspeed events. Manufacturers also introduced improvements related to pitot tube performance and refined operational guidance for similar situations. The accident became a reference point throughout commercial aviation, illustrating that even highly automated aircraft still depend upon pilots understanding the aircraft's fundamental aerodynamic behavior when automation can no longer provide clear guidance. Listening to the final minutes today reveals that the greatest challenge inside the cockpit was not the storm itself, but the uncertainty created by information the crew could no longer fully trust. Every recorded exchange reflects professionals attempting to understand a rapidly changing situation, using instruments that no longer presented a completely consistent picture. The Atlantic concealed the wreckage for years, but once investigators recovered the recorders, the mystery shifted from discovering what happened to understanding how confidence gradually dissolved inside one of the world's most technologically advanced flight decks. When the recorders finally revealed the last moments of Air France Flight 447, they showed that certainty had disappeared long before the aircraft did, when the instruments couldn't be trusted. From the perspective of an air traffic controller, countless flights begin and end with conversations so ordinary that they are forgotten almost as soon as they are spoken. Pilots report their altitude, confirm their route, acknowledge instructions, and continue toward destinations that rarely require further attention. Controllers cannot see every detail unfolding inside a cockpit hundreds of kilometers away. They depend on radar returns, scheduled radio calls, and the expectation that routine communication will continue exactly as it has for every other aircraft crossing their airspace. Occasionally, however, an exchange that sounds completely unremarkable becomes the final indication that everything aboard still appears normal. Flying from Surabaya to Manado on New Year's Day, 2007, Adam Air Flight 574 settled into what initially appeared to be another routine domestic journey across Indonesia. The Boeing 737-400 departed Juanda International Airport, carrying 96 passengers and 6 crew members for the flight north towards Sam Ratulangi Airport. Indonesia's vast geography depends heavily on commercial aviation, with aircraft routinely crossing islands separated by seas and mountainous terrain. For experienced crews, the route represented a familiar operation, rather than an unusually demanding flight. Weather along portions of the route required attention but remained within conditions routinely encountered by commercial pilots operating in the region. Areas of convective cloud and turbulence prompted crews to consider modest deviations from their planned course, an everyday occurrence in tropical airspace. Air traffic controllers coordinated these adjustments while monitoring multiple aircraft moving through neighbouring sectors. Nothing about Flight 574's progress initially distinguished it from the many other flights sharing Indonesian skies that afternoon. Within the aircraft, however, one navigation system had already developed a history of occasionally demanding the crew's attention. Investigators later determined that the aircraft's inertial reference system, commonly known as the IRS, had experienced recurring faults before the accident flight. The system assists with navigation by calculating the aircraft's position and movement, and intermittent problems had been documented previously. Such faults did not automatically place an aircraft in immediate danger, but they required pilots to evaluate the indications carefully and, when appropriate, perform established troubleshooting procedures. Resolving that indication began as a familiar cockpit task, rather than an emergency requiring immediate concern. Crews are trained to manage system irregularities while continuing normal flight operations, following checklists and standard procedures whenever possible. Problems of this kind are expected to occur occasionally during the operational life of modern aircraft, and pilots routinely address them without affecting the safety of the flight. Nothing about the appearance of the navigation fault alone suggested that the aircraft was approaching a catastrophic situation. routine communication with air traffic control gave no indication that the circumstances inside the cockpit had become increasingly complex. The crew continued exchanging standard radio messages with controllers, acknowledging instructions and maintaining communication consistent with an aircraft progressing normally along its route. There was no distress call, no request for emergency assistance, and no indication that the pilots believed they were confronting a situation beyond their ability to manage. To everyone monitoring the flight from the ground, Flight 574 remained another aircraft, continuing toward its destination. Radar contact nevertheless began telling a different story. Instead of maintaining the stable flight path expected during cruise, the aircraft's recorded movement started changing in ways that attracted attention only after investigators reconstructed the final minutes. From the perspective of controllers, the loss of radar contact appeared sudden. They had no direct view into the cockpit and no immediate explanation for why communication had ended. The last routine exchange therefore became the final confirmed moment when Flight 574 still appeared entirely ordinary from outside the aircraft. Search operations soon focused on the Makassar Strait, the body of water separating the islands of Borneo and Sulawesi. Aircraft, ships and rescue teams searched for survivors while attempting to determine where the Boeing had gone down. Unlike accidents in remote mountains or vast oceanic regions, investigators possessed a reasonably defined search area based on radar information and the aircraft's planned route. Even so, recovering meaningful evidence required overcoming difficult sea conditions and locating wreckage scattered across the water. Floating debris eventually confirmed that the aircraft had crashed into the sea, but understanding why proved far more difficult than locating where. Recovery teams continued searching for major wreckage components as investigators began examining maintenance records, crew qualifications, operational history, and weather conditions. The final radio communication itself offered almost no hint of the events that had unfolded afterward. As in many aviation investigations, the most important questions could only be answered by recovering the aircraft's flight recorders. When those recorders were eventually recovered, investigators gained the ability to reconstruct the accident minute by minute. The recordings revealed that the navigation system fault had occupied a growing share of the crew's attention. Rather than remaining a brief troubleshooting task, the effort to address the IRS problem continued while other aspects of flying the aircraft required equal vigilance. The investigation showed that the technical fault itself was manageable, but the cockpit workload it created gradually became far more significant than the warning that first appeared. Analysis of the flight data demonstrated that the aircraft's autopilot disengaged, while the crew remained focused on the navigation issue. As manual flight resumed, the Boeing gradually entered an increasing bank angle. Instead of immediately recognizing and correcting the developing deviation, the crew's situational awareness deteriorated as attention remained divided between troubleshooting and aircraft control. The aircraft eventually entered a steep descent from which recovery was no longer achieved. Investigators found no evidence that the Boeing suffered a structural failure before the loss of control. The official investigation concluded that the accident resulted from a combination of technical issues and human factors rather than a single isolated cause. The recurring IRS malfunction contributed to the sequence by creating an ongoing distraction, but investigators also determined that cockpit resource management, task prioritization, and monitoring of the aircraft's attitude played equally important roles. The accident illustrated how a problem that initially appears manageable can gradually reshape decision-making if it begins consuming more attention than the flight itself. The findings also highlighted the importance of maintaining what pilots often describe as the first priority of aviation: fly the aircraft. Troubleshooting, navigation, communication, and checklist procedures all remain essential, but each depends upon preserving continuous control of the aircraft above everything else. The investigation into Flight 574 reinforced that principle through painful experience, demonstrating how quickly priorities can shift inside a cockpit when multiple demands compete simultaneously for the crew's attention. Indonesia's aviation industry underwent significant scrutiny in the years following the accident, with regulators examining operational oversight, airline safety practices, maintenance procedures, and pilot training. Adam Air itself faced increasing regulatory pressure before ceasing operations in 2008. Although the disappearance of Flight 574 initially appeared mysterious to those watching radar screens and awaiting another routine transmission, the investigation ultimately transformed the case into an important study of human performance, cockpit workload, and operational discipline. Looking back through the final minutes today, the last routine communication with air traffic control sounds almost indistinguishable from thousands of others recorded every day around the world. Nothing in those calm exchanges warned controllers that the aircraft's greatest challenge was developing silently inside the cockpit rather than outside it. The mystery did not survive because investigators lacked evidence forever. It endured because the evidence revealed how an ordinary technical problem gradually drew attention away from the one responsibility that could never be postponed. The last routine transmission from Adam Air Flight 574 carried no hint that the flight's greatest danger had already begun inside the cockpit: smoke in the cockpit. Unlike many other in-flight emergencies, smoke demands action long before its source can be identified with certainty. Pilots are trained to treat the first indication of smoke or an unusual odour as a potentially serious event because its origin may be hidden behind panels, above ceilings, or inside electrical systems that cannot be inspected during flight. A warning light may identify a failed component, and an engine malfunction may reveal itself through changing instrument readings, but smoke often provides almost no immediate explanation. It simply announces that something is wrong, while leaving the crew to determine how much time remains before the situation changes. Late on the evening of September 2nd, 1998, Swissair Flight 111 departed New York for Geneva, carrying 215 passengers and 14 crew members across a route flown countless times before. The McDonnell Douglas MD-11 had climbed normally into cruise altitude over the northeastern United States before continuing northeast toward the Atlantic. The flight deck was occupied by Captain Ernst Zimmermann and First Officer Stefan Löw, both experienced pilots operating a modern long-range aircraft designed for international routes. Nothing during departure or the early stages of the journey suggested that the flight would soon confront one of aviation's most influential accident investigations. Cruising normally over the North Atlantic, the MD-11 showed little indication that an emergency was beginning to develop behind its cockpit panels. The aircraft maintained its assigned altitude while crossing Canadian airspace, and routine communications with air traffic control reflected a flight progressing as expected. To controllers monitoring the aircraft from the ground, Flight 111 remained another transatlantic service, moving steadily toward Europe. The first indication that circumstances had changed came not from a distress call, but from the crew reporting an unusual odour in the cockpit. An unfamiliar odour soon drew the pilot's attention to a problem that initially appeared manageable through established procedures. Shortly afterward, the crew reported smoke in the cockpit and requested permission to divert. They selected Halifax International Airport in Nova Scotia as the most suitable destination, a decision consistent with the information available at the time. The communication remained calm and professional. There was no indication that the crew believed the aircraft was moments from catastrophe. Instead, they responded exactly as training required, identifying the problem and beginning preparations for an expedited landing. Professional checklists guided each decision as the pilots evaluated the situation and prepared to divert toward the nearest suitable airport. Smoke and fumes checklists exist to help flight crews identify possible electrical failures, isolate affected systems, and reduce the risk of a hidden fire spreading through the aircraft. Completing those procedures required careful coordination, while simultaneously navigating toward Halifax and communicating with air traffic control. Every action appeared methodical because that is precisely how airline crews are trained to respond when confronting an abnormal situation. Choosing where to land required balancing urgency against the practical demands of safely bringing a heavily fueled aircraft back to the ground. Having departed only a short time earlier for an intercontinental flight, the MD-11 still carried a substantial fuel load. The crew initially discussed dumping fuel to reduce landing weight before touching down. Under ordinary circumstances, such a decision reflected sound operational planning designed to improve landing safety. Yet emergencies have a way of changing more quickly than the assumptions upon which those plans are based. Meanwhile, the conditions inside the cockpit continued changing more rapidly than anyone yet understood. Smoke became increasingly noticeable as the fire spread through concealed areas above the cockpit ceiling. Investigators would later determine that flames were advancing behind interior panels, damaging electrical wiring and systems hidden from direct view. From the pilot's perspective, the smoke provided evidence that the situation was worsening, but not a clear picture of how extensively the fire had already progressed beyond the areas they could observe. electrical systems gradually began exhibiting the effects of the growing fire. As wiring became damaged, instruments and onboard equipment started failing in ways that complicated the crew's efforts to understand the emergency. Every new indication required interpretation, while visibility inside the cockpit continued deteriorating. Unlike a fire visible within the cabin, this emergency remained largely concealed, advancing through spaces that neither pilots nor passengers could inspect. The danger therefore expanded faster than anyone aboard could accurately measure. One transmission captured the moment when the situation could no longer be treated as a precautionary diversion. The crew informed air traffic control, "We have to land immediately." Those words marked a significant change in the urgency of the flight. What had begun as a controlled response to smoke had evolved into an emergency demanding the fastest possible arrival. Controllers immediately prioritized the aircraft and continued assisting the crew, but the available time had already become far shorter than anyone outside the cockpit realized. Communication ended only moments after the crew made clear that landing could no longer wait. Radar data showed the aircraft turning as part of its approach toward Halifax before contact was lost over the waters near Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia. The MD-11 impacted the Atlantic Ocean, ending the flight less than an hour after the first report of smoke. The final radio transmissions reflected professionalism until the very end, even as the emergency accelerated beyond the crew's ability to contain it. Recovery crews faced an immense task as wreckage settled across the seabed off Nova Scotia. The impact scattered aircraft components over a wide underwater area, requiring a carefully coordinated recovery effort involving ships, divers, remotely operated equipment, and forensic specialists. Unlike many earlier aviation mysteries where little evidence could be recovered, investigators succeeded in retrieving the overwhelming majority of the aircraft. Every fragment became part of an enormous reconstruction effort intended to reveal how an apparently manageable emergency had become uncontrollable within such a short period. Reconstructing the aircraft required investigators to examine hundreds of thousands of recovered pieces from the wreckage. Specialists painstakingly identified, catalogued, and analysed damaged components to determine where the fire had originated and how it had spread. This meticulous process revealed burn patterns, electrical damage, and structural evidence impossible to understand from radio communications alone. Piece by piece, the reconstruction transformed scattered debris into a detailed timeline of the aircraft's final minutes. Evidence gradually revealed that the fire had spread through areas largely hidden from both pilots and passengers. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada concluded that the fire most likely originated in the overhead area behind the cockpit and spread rapidly through flammable insulation materials installed during modifications to the aircraft. As the flames advanced, they disabled critical electrical systems, reducing the crew's ability to manage the emergency, while simultaneously increasing the severity of the conditions inside the cockpit. By the time the pilots recognized the full urgency of the situation, the fire had already progressed beyond what existing procedures had anticipated. Investigators concluded that the emergency evolved far faster than the procedures available at the time had been designed to address. The crew followed accepted practices based upon the information they possessed, yet the hidden fire advanced through the aircraft with devastating speed. The accident demonstrated that smoke emergencies could deteriorate far more rapidly than many operational assumptions suggested, particularly when combustible materials allowed flames to spread beyond immediately accessible areas. The findings reshaped aircraft certification standards, onboard materials, and the aviation industry's understanding of in-flight fires. Regulators introduced stricter requirements governing insulation materials, electrical wiring, fire testing, and emergency procedures, while manufacturers and airlines reassessed how crews should respond when smoke appears inside an aircraft. The investigation became a landmark study showing that preventing the spread of hidden fire is often just as important as extinguishing its source. Listening to the final communications today reveals not a crew losing composure, but one steadily losing the time needed to overcome the emergency. Every radio transmission reflects disciplined decision-making under increasingly difficult circumstances, yet each exchange also marks another moment during which the unseen fire continued advancing beyond the cockpit panels. The tragedy of Swissair Flight 111 lies not in hesitation or confusion, but in the relentless speed with which an invisible threat overtook even the most professional response. When Swissair Flight 111 finally declared that it had to land immediately, the The investigation later showed that the fire had already taken more time than the crew could afford to lose. 4 engines fell silent. Some of the greatest dangers in aviation leave no obvious warning for pilots to see until they have already entered them. Storms usually appear on weather radar. Turbulence often announces itself through changing conditions, and mechanical failures reveal themselves through instruments designed to detect them. Yet the atmosphere occasionally conceals hazards that neither the eye nor the aircraft can immediately recognize. They drift silently through the sky, blending into the darkness so completely that a flight crew may continue believing everything is normal while the first signs of trouble are already beginning around them. Crossing Southeast Asia during the night, British Airways Flight 9 carried 248 passengers and 15 crew members aboard a Boeing 747-36B on the latest stage of a journey linking London with Auckland, New Zealand. On June 24, 1982, the aircraft departed Kuala Lumpur for Perth, Australia, climbing to its cruising altitude as it continued south across Indonesia. Long-haul international flights followed this route regularly, and the experienced crew expected another uneventful overnight crossing above the islands scattered beneath them. Nothing during departure or the early stages of cruise suggested that the aircraft was approaching one of aviation's most extraordinary emergencies. Clear skies and routine cruise conditions offered little reason for the crew to suspect that the surrounding atmosphere had quietly become hazardous. Weather radar displayed no severe storm directly ahead, and there were no reports describing an immediate threat along the planned route. Far below, however, Indonesia's volcanic landscape remained active. Earlier that day, Mount Galunggung on the island of Java had erupted, sending enormous quantities of volcanic ash high into the atmosphere. At the time, comprehensive systems for tracking airborne volcanic ash clouds did not yet exist, and flight crews received little information about hazards that could remain invisible over vast distances. Subtle changes outside the aircraft appeared long before anyone understood what they were trying to reveal. Passengers and crew began noticing an unusual glow surrounding portions of the aircraft, accompanied by flickering flashes dancing across the windscreen. The effect resembled what pilots sometimes associated with St. Elmo's fire, a phenomenon caused by electrical discharge under certain atmospheric conditions. At the same time, a faint haze became visible beyond the cockpit windows. None of these observations immediately pointed toward volcanic ash, because few airline crews had ever encountered such conditions at cruising altitude. Another unexpected clue soon emerged as a distinct smell entered the aircraft. Fine particles began affecting the cabin environment, while the cockpit crew continued assessing unusual visual effects outside the airplane. Even then, the evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. No single observation explained the others, and nothing suggested that every engine aboard one of the world's largest passenger aircraft was about to face the same unseen threat simultaneously. One engine then began behaving in a way that initially seemed difficult to explain. Engine number 4 surged before losing power, prompting the crew to evaluate what appeared to be an isolated malfunction. Moments later, another engine failed, then another. Before long, all 4 engines had stopped producing thrust. The silence that followed was almost unimaginable. A Boeing 747 had become a glider at more than 37,000 feet above the Indian Ocean and the islands of Indonesia, an event so unprecedented that neither the crew nor the controllers listening to the radio had any previous experience upon which to rely. Within moments, an emergency almost no airline crew had ever imagined unfolded across the flight deck. Without engine thrust, the aircraft immediately began descending, while essential electrical and hydraulic systems shifted to alternate sources of power. The crew worked methodically through engine restart procedures, balancing the urgent need to restore power with the practical reality that altitude represented their most valuable remaining resource. Every 1,000 feet lost reduced the amount of time available before reaching terrain or the sea below. The captain's Mayday transmission described a situation so extraordinary that it has remained one of the most memorable radio calls in aviation history. Captain Eric Moody calmly informed air traffic control, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, we have a problem. All 4 engines have stopped." He then added words that reflected remarkable composure despite the unprecedented emergency, explaining that they were doing their utmost to regain control and expressing confidence that the situation would not inconvenience the passengers for too long. The transmission revealed professionalism under extraordinary circumstances, Yet it also underscored the almost impossible nature of what had occurred. Gliding without engine power, the crew worked through every available procedure while the aircraft continued descending through the darkness. Restart attempts continued as the pilots monitored engine instruments and prepared for the possibility that none would respond. A Boeing 747 possesses impressive gliding capability for an aircraft of its size, but even that capability has limits. Every calculation now depended upon whether engine power could be restored before the aircraft descended beyond a recoverable altitude. An unexpected change gradually suggested that the impossible might not remain permanent. As the aircraft descended into denser, cooler air, one engine finally restarted. Shortly afterward, another came back to life, followed by the remaining engines. Investigators would later determine that the descending aircraft had passed into conditions where molten volcanic deposits inside the engines began cooling and breaking away, allowing normal airflow to resume. The return of engine power transformed an almost hopeless situation into one that once again offered the possibility of a safe landing. Landing safely did not end the mystery so much as begin the search for its true cause. Although the crew successfully diverted to Jakarta's Halim Perdanakusuma Airport, the aircraft had suffered extensive damage. The windscreen had become severely abraded by countless microscopic particles striking it at high speed, reducing forward visibility during the final approach. Engine inspections also revealed evidence of unusual internal damage that demanded explanation. Investigators now faced an important question. What could simultaneously disable 4 modern jet engines without permanently destroying them? Investigators soon turned their attention away from the aircraft itself and toward the air through which it had flown. Meteorological information, volcanic activity reports, engine examinations and laboratory analysis gradually pointed toward the ash cloud produced by Mount Galunggung. Unlike ordinary smoke or dust, volcanic ash consists of extremely hard particles capable of surviving long journeys through the atmosphere. At cruising altitude, the cloud had appeared almost invisible, particularly at night, leaving the crew with virtually no visual warning before entering it. Evidence eventually demonstrated that microscopic volcanic ash behaved unlike almost any other hazard known to commercial aviation at the time. As the particles entered the engines, temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius caused portions of the ash to melt. The molten material then adhered to internal engine components before solidifying in cooler sections farther downstream, disrupting airflow and causing the engines to flame out. Because the ash cloud itself remained largely invisible to radar and difficult to distinguish visually, crews possessed little opportunity to avoid it without prior warning. Scientific analysis transformed British Airways Flight 9 from an extraordinary survival story into a turning point for aviation safety. Engineers, volcanologists, meteorologists, and regulators collaborated to better understand how volcanic eruptions could threaten aircraft operating hundreds of kilometers away from the eruption itself. Their work eventually led to improved engine certification knowledge, expanded volcanic monitoring, and closer cooperation between scientific agencies and aviation authorities. International aviation responded by establishing dedicated volcanic ash advisory centers, responsible for detecting eruptions, tracking ash clouds, and distributing timely warnings to airlines around the world. Satellite observation, atmospheric modeling, and global communication networks now provide flight crews with information that simply did not exist in 1982. Modern pilots routinely receive volcanic ash advisories because of lessons learned from incidents like Flight 9, reducing the likelihood that another crew will unknowingly enter such an environment. Viewed today, the flight stands as a reminder that the most dangerous part of the journey had never been inside the aircraft at all. The engines, the crew, and the aircraft each responded according to the circumstances confronting them, yet the true threat surrounded the Boeing long before anyone recognized its presence. The final Mayday remains unforgettable, not because it described mechanical failure, but because it captured a moment when an invisible force briefly accomplished what seemed impossible by silencing every engine aboard a 4-engine airliner. Long after the final Mayday, British Airways Flight 9 revealed that the greatest threat in the sky had been the one no one yet knew how to see. The ocean became the runway. Far from any coastline, an aircraft carries one unavoidable truth wherever it flies: there are places where landing simply is not supposed to be possible. Modern airliners routinely cross oceans because their engines, navigation systems, and careful planning make those journeys remarkably reliable. Yet every transoceanic flight also depends upon the quiet assumption that, if something goes seriously wrong, there will still be enough options left to reach solid ground. Once that assumption begins to disappear, pilots are forced to think differently. The question is no longer how to complete the flight, but how to survive the part of the journey no one ever expects to face. Operating across the vast Pacific, Pan American World Airways Flight 6 departed with every expectation of completing another routine transoceanic crossing. On October 16, 1956, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser was flying from Honolulu towards San Francisco with 24 passengers and a crew of 7 aboard. The Stratocruiser represented one of the most advanced long-range airliners of its era, designed specifically for the demanding distances that separated the islands of the Pacific from the North American mainland. Crews operating these routes understood the unique challenges of oceanic flying, but experience also brought confidence that careful planning could safely overcome them. Mechanical difficulties first appeared gradually rather than all at once, giving the crew reason to believe the flight might still reach safety. One of the aircraft's engines developed problems that eventually required it to be shut down. Losing a single engine on a 4-engine aircraft did not automatically place a flight in immediate danger, and crews trained extensively for such situations. The aircraft remained controllable, communications continued normally, and attention turned toward determining the safest way to complete the journey. The situation became more complicated as additional mechanical concerns affected another engine. Although the Stratocruiser remained airborne, the loss of performance significantly altered the crew's calculations. Long-distance flights over the Pacific depended upon carefully balanced fuel consumption, cruising altitude, aircraft weight, and remaining distance to land. Every new estimate forced the pilots to reconsider options that had seemed entirely reasonable only minutes earlier. Careful calculations soon replaced optimism as fuel, distance, and aircraft performance began narrowing the available choices. The crew evaluated whether continuing towards San Francisco remained practical, or whether another destination offered a better chance of success. Unlike emergencies over populated regions, the Pacific offered almost no alternate airports. Vast stretches of uninterrupted ocean meant that every decision carried consequences, measured not in minutes, but in hundreds of kilometers. Each revised estimate quietly confirmed that every remaining airport was becoming more difficult to reach. The aircraft's reduced performance limited altitude, increased fuel consumption, and steadily eroded the margin needed to arrive safely on land. Controllers, company personnel, and the crew continued examining every available possibility, but mathematics proved less flexible than hope. Distance could not be negotiated, and fuel reserves could not be expanded simply by wishing for another solution. Accepting the ocean as the only remaining landing site required a different kind of decision from any the crew had expected to make that day. Ditching an airliner was never considered a desirable outcome, yet under certain circumstances it represented the safest remaining option. Once that reality became unavoidable, the nature of the emergency changed completely. Instead of searching for another airport, the crew began preparing for an operation requiring extraordinary precision, coordination, and discipline. Final radio communications reflected remarkable composure as the pilots coordinated rescue efforts while preparing for an emergency few airline crews ever experience. Rather than transmitting confusion or panic, the crew worked with air traffic services and rescue authorities to ensure that assistance would arrive as quickly as possible after the ditching. Their communications also helped guide the United States Coast Guard cutter USS Pontchartrain toward the aircraft's projected location, greatly improving the chances of a rapid rescue once the aircraft reached the water. Inside the cabin, every instruction now served a single purpose, giving passengers the best possible chance of surviving what came next. Flight attendants prepared the cabin according to established emergency procedures while keeping passengers informed and as calm as circumstances allowed. Loose objects were secured, life jackets readied, and everyone aboard prepared for a landing unlike anything most had ever imagined. The professionalism displayed throughout the cabin reflected the same disciplined approach guiding the decisions on the flight deck. Contact with the Pacific was approached not as an impact to endure, but as a landing to execute with extraordinary precision. The crew carefully controlled airspeed, descent rate, and aircraft attitude, understanding that even relatively small deviations could dramatically affect the outcome. Unlike a conventional runway, the ocean offered no markings, no lighting, and no forgiving pavement. its surface changed constantly with wind and waves, demanding precise judgment during the final moments before touchdown. The Stratocruiser struck the Pacific with considerable force but remained sufficiently intact to allow evacuation. Although the aircraft eventually sank, everyone aboard survived the ditching itself. Rescue operations by the nearby Pontchartrain proceeded quickly, bringing passengers and crew safely aboard. The outcome reflected not good fortune alone, but a chain of disciplined decisions extending back through every stage of the emergency, from the earliest engine problems to the final approach over open water. Examining the accident afterward revealed that survival had depended upon countless decisions made long before the aircraft reached the sea. Investigators carefully reconstructed the sequence of mechanical failures, operational choices, fuel planning, communication, and rescue coordination that shaped the flight's outcome. Rather than identifying a single dramatic action that determined survival, the investigation highlighted how many individually correct decisions combined to produce a remarkably successful emergency response under exceptionally difficult circumstances. Investigators praised not a single dramatic action, but a sequence of disciplined choices carried out under steadily worsening conditions. The crew continuously reassessed the aircraft's capabilities, adapted their plans as circumstances changed, communicated effectively with authorities, and prepared both the cockpit and cabin for the only remaining option. Their actions demonstrated that professionalism often reveals itself not through spectacular heroics, but through calm adherence to sound judgment when ordinary solutions have disappeared. The flight soon became an enduring example of how preparation and teamwork can reshape the outcome of even the most unforgiving emergency. Airlines, regulators, and training organizations study the ditching as evidence that disciplined cockpit resource management, effective cabin coordination, and accurate communication could dramatically improve survival during rare but demanding situations. Although few crews would ever face a similar event, the lessons extended well beyond a single aircraft or airline. Future generations of pilots would study the ditching not because it avoided danger, but because it confronted danger with exceptional discipline. Aviation cannot eliminate every mechanical failure or predict every emergency, yet careful preparation can influence what happens after unexpected circumstances arise. Pan Am Flight 6 demonstrated that even when reaching land becomes impossible, thoughtful decision-making can still shape the outcome in remarkable ways. Remembering the flight today means recognizing that its greatest achievement began only after every ordinary solution had disappeared. By the time the final communications were exchanged, the emergency no longer revolved around reaching an airport. It revolved around transforming an expanse of open ocean into the only landing area left. The Pacific remained every bit as unforgiving as it had always been, but the crew's preparation ensured that survival depended not on impossible luck, but on disciplined execution. By the final transmission from Pan Am Flight 6, the crew was no longer searching for a runway. They were preparing to create one upon the Pacific itself. 32 minutes of desperation. Most aviation emergencies unfold so quickly that pilots have only moments to react before the outcome is decided. A warning appears, a checklist begins, and within minutes the aircraft has either recovered or reached the ground. There are, however, a handful of flights that refuse to follow that pattern. Instead of ending almost immediately, they continue far longer than anyone believes possible, turning every passing minute into another opportunity to regain control. Each successful correction briefly suggests that the crisis might yet be overcome, only for the aircraft to break away once again, forcing the crew into another exhausting struggle against forces they can no longer fully command. Leaving Tokyo for the short journey to Osaka, Japan Airlines Flight 123 climbed away carrying 509 passengers and 15 crew members aboard a Boeing 747SR on the evening of August 12, 1985. The route ranked among Japan's busiest domestic services, flown repeatedly by experienced crews transporting hundreds of travellers between two of the country's largest cities. Departure from Haneda Airport proceeded normally. The climb was uneventful, and routine communications reflected an aircraft following its planned course. Nothing during those first minutes hinted that the flight would soon become the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. Everything changed in an instant when a violent structural failure erupted near the rear of the aircraft. Passengers and crew heard an explosive bang as the rear pressure bulkhead failed, producing rapid decompression and unleashing tremendous forces inside the tail section. The explosion tore away much of the vertical stabilizer while destroying all 4 independent hydraulic systems that powered the aircraft's primary flight controls. Within seconds, the Boeing remained airborne, but the mechanisms that normally allowed pilots to control pitch, roll and yaw had effectively disappeared. Escaping air tore through the damaged tail with extraordinary force, leaving the crew confronted by an aircraft that no longer responded in familiar ways. Conventional control inputs produced little or no predictable result because the elevators, rudder and ailerons depended upon hydraulic pressure that had suddenly been lost. The airplane instead began oscillating through a repeating motion known as a phugoid cycle, alternately climbing and descending while banking unpredictably. Rather than responding smoothly to pilot commands, the aircraft seemed to develop a will of its own, forcing every correction to become an experiment rather than a certainty. Faced with an aircraft that no longer responded normally, the crew immediately began searching for any remaining method of steering it. Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda worked together continuously, attempting to understand the unprecedented damage while communicating with air traffic control and coordinating every available option. Their cockpit became a place of constant calculation rather than panic, as each new movement of the aircraft demanded another attempt to stabilize it before the next oscillation began. Engine thrust soon became one of the few tools still capable of influencing the aircraft's unpredictable movements. By adjusting power between the engines, the crew discovered they could achieve limited changes in the aircraft's attitude, though never with the precision normally provided by functioning flight controls. Each improvement came at a cost. Correcting one movement often introduced another, requiring continual adjustments simply to prevent the aircraft from diverging further from controlled flight. The Boeing remained airborne not because it had regained normal controllability, but because the crew refused to stop searching for ways to influence it. Radio transmissions captured experienced pilots refusing to surrender control despite the extraordinary damage surrounding them. The crew declared an emergency and requested an immediate return to Haneda, while controllers offered headings, altitudes, and assistance whenever possible. Every exchange reflected disciplined communication under conditions unlike anything anticipated during routine airline training. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed professionals sharing observations, confirming actions, and adapting continuously as the aircraft behaved in ways few pilots had ever experienced. Minute after minute, the Boeing continued climbing, descending, and turning in ways that reflected both determined corrections and relentless instability. The aircraft drifted across mountainous terrain while repeatedly departing from the paths the crew attempted to establish. Yet each time control appeared to slip away completely, another carefully judged thrust adjustment produced a partial recovery. Those repeated moments prevented the struggle from ending quickly, extending the flight into one of the longest recorded attempts to control a catastrophically damaged airliner. Every brief improvement suggested that recovery might still be possible before another violent movement erased the progress that had just been made. Air traffic controllers remained in communication, believing that if the crew could maintain enough control to reach an airport, a landing might still be achievable. Inside the cockpit, however, every passing minute also meant another minute spent managing an aircraft whose damaged structure continued responding unpredictably to aerodynamic forces. Hope never disappeared entirely, but neither did the immense difficulty of sustaining even temporary control. The prolonged struggle finally ended when the aircraft struck mountainous terrain near Mount Takamagahara, northwest of Tokyo. Of the 524 people aboard, only 4 survived. Rescue operations began under difficult conditions, complicated by the remote location of the wreckage and the darkness that had already settled across the mountains. The accident shocked Japan and the international aviation community alike, not only because of the immense loss of life, but because so many had listened as the crew continued fighting for more than half an hour after the initial catastrophe. Investigators reconstructed those final 32 minutes using the cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder, wreckage distribution, structural examinations, maintenance records, and engineering analysis. The evidence revealed that the aircraft had remained airborne solely because the crew continually adapted to circumstances no simulator had ever fully prepared them to face. Every oscillation, heading change, and altitude variation became part of an extraordinary reconstruction, showing just how long disciplined flying could delay the inevitable after catastrophic structural damage. Their analysis traced the disaster to a repair performed 7 years earlier after the aircraft suffered a tail strike during landing. The official investigation determined that the rear pressure bulkhead had been repaired incorrectly, using a splice plate that did not conform to Boeing's approved repair procedure. Over thousands of subsequent pressurization cycles, metal fatigue gradually developed until the bulkhead finally failed during Flight 123. The catastrophe therefore originated not from a sudden manufacturing defect or an error made during the flight itself, but from structural weakness that had remained hidden for years. The findings reshaped maintenance oversight by demonstrating how a single incorrect structural repair could survive unnoticed until the consequences became irreversible. Airlines, manufacturers, and regulators strengthened inspection practices, repair verification procedures, and fatigue monitoring to reduce the likelihood of similar failures. The accident also deepened engineering understanding of how structural damage can propagate slowly over many years before reaching a catastrophic breaking point, reminding the aviation industry that maintenance decisions can influence flights long after those who performed them have moved on. Pilots and engineers alike continue studying the accident because it revealed both the limits of aircraft design and the extraordinary determination of a professional crew. The investigation acknowledged that the complete loss of hydraulic control left almost no realistic means of fully recovering the aircraft, yet it also demonstrated how resourcefulness, teamwork, and persistence allowed the flight to remain airborne for an astonishing 32 minutes. Those final communications remain remarkable, not because they solved the emergency, but because they documented a crew that continued searching for solutions until the very end. Measured only by time, the struggle lasted just over half an hour. Measured by what unfolded inside the cockpit, those minutes became an extraordinary demonstration of discipline under circumstances almost beyond imagination. Every transmission, every adjustment of engine thrust, and every attempt to steady the aircraft reflected professionals refusing to abandon their responsibilities, even after the airplane had lost the systems upon which every modern airliner depends. The final cockpit voices from Japan Airlines, Flight 123, remain unforgettable because they recorded not a surrender to catastrophe, but 32 relentless minutes of refusing to stop fighting it. The calls that led nowhere. Every routine position report is intended to mark progress, quietly confirming that an aircraft has safely reached another point along its route before continuing toward the next. Over long stretches of ocean, where radar coverage has traditionally been limited or entirely absent, these scheduled reports become the invisible thread connecting a flight to the outside world. Each transmission reassures controllers that the aircraft remains on course, allowing them to mark another successful milestone before waiting for the next call. The system depends upon continuity. Every report is expected to be followed by another and another after that. When the sequence ends without explanation, investigators are left with something unusual. Not the beginning of an answer, but the exact point where certainty stops. Chartered to transport United States military personnel across the Pacific, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 departed believing its longest challenge would simply be the distance ahead. On March 16, 1962, the Lockheed L-1049H Super Constellation operated by Flying Tiger Line was carrying 93 United States Army personnel along with a civilian crew as part of a military charter flight bound for Southeast Asia. After earlier stops during its trans-Pacific journey, the aircraft departed Guam for Clark Air Base in the Philippines, following a route that countless military and civilian aircraft had completed before. The Pacific remained vast, but the procedures guiding such crossings had become familiar through years of long-distance operations. Nothing in the aircraft's final routine transmission suggested that it would become the last confirmed contact anyone would ever receive. The crew completed a standard position report while crossing the Pacific, communicating exactly as expected during an ordinary oceanic flight. There was no distress call, no report of mechanical difficulty, no request for assistance, and no indication that conditions aboard had changed in any unusual way. Had another position report followed on schedule, the earlier transmission would likely have disappeared into the countless routine exchanges recorded during transoceanic aviation. Controllers continued expecting another position report because there was no immediate reason to believe anything had interrupted the flight. Oceanic communications often involved intervals of silence between scheduled reports, making the absence of an immediate transmission unremarkable at first. Radio operators continued monitoring assigned frequencies while expecting the familiar voice of Flight 739 to return at the appropriate time. During those first moments, nothing distinguished the growing silence from the ordinary rhythm of long-range aviation. Repeated attempts to re-establish communication gradually transformed ordinary radio silence into growing concern. Calls directed toward Flight 739 received no reply, prompting additional efforts from ground stations and nearby aircraft operating in the region. As minutes became longer than expected, confidence slowly gave way to uncertainty. Every unsuccessful attempt narrowed the possibilities while providing no explanation for what had interrupted a flight that had shown no sign of difficulty only moments earlier. Search aircraft and naval vessels soon spread across enormous sections of the Western Pacific in hopes of finding even the smallest trace of the missing aircraft. The search expanded into one of the largest conducted for a military charter flight, involving aircraft, ships, and coordinated efforts across a vast area of ocean. Search crews scanned the sea for floating wreckage, life rafts, oil slicks, or any evidence capable of revealing the aircraft's fate. The Pacific, however, offered remarkably little in return. Hour after hour, the ocean refused to provide the evidence investigators expected to discover. No confirmed debris field emerged to define a search area. No emergency equipment was recovered to indicate that the aircraft had remained intact long enough for evacuation. No floating wreckage established a point of impact. Every unsuccessful search flight increased the unsettling possibility that the aircraft had disappeared without leaving investigators the physical evidence upon which aviation investigations normally depend. One reported observation briefly appeared capable of explaining the disappearance before raising as many questions as it answered. The crew of the Liberian tanker T.L. Lenson reported observing what they described as a bright flash in the sky, followed by what appeared to be a burning object descending toward the ocean around the time Flight 739 disappeared. Such an observation naturally attracted immediate attention because it offered a possible explanation where almost none existed. Yet despite careful examination, investigators could never conclusively connect the reported flash to the missing aircraft. The account remained an important lead, but never became confirmed evidence. Investigators examined every available account, radio log, maintenance record, weather report, and witness statement in an effort to reconstruct events beyond the final transmission. Weather conditions did not indicate an extraordinary storm along the route. No confirmed radio distress call had been received. Maintenance records failed to identify any immediate issue capable of explaining the disappearance with certainty. Without wreckage to examine or flight recorders to recover, investigators repeatedly encountered the same obstacle. Every promising avenue eventually ended where the evidence itself ended. Without wreckage, survivors, or flight recorders, each possible explanation remained anchored more in possibility than proof. Mechanical failure, structural breakup, sabotage, collision, and even the reported explosion witnessed from the tanker all received consideration over the years. Each theory attempted to explain the aircraft's disappearance, yet everyone relied upon evidence too limited to produce a definitive conclusion. Unlike accidents where investigators gradually replace uncertainty with documented findings, Flight 739 remained suspended between competing possibilities. Official inquiries gradually reached the difficult conclusion that the available evidence simply could not support a definitive cause. The Civil Aeronautics Board acknowledged that the disappearance could not be explained on the basis of the information recovered. Rather than identifying a probable sequence of events, investigators were forced to recognize the limits imposed by missing evidence. It remains one of the rare aviation cases where the official record concludes not with certainty, but with the acknowledgement that certainty was never achieved. The disappearance nevertheless became one of the largest unresolved losses involving a military charter aircraft in aviation history. 96 people vanished without confirmed wreckage ever being recovered, leaving families, military authorities, and investigators without the answers that aviation accidents normally strive to provide. As decades passed, the absence of physical evidence transformed the case from an active investigation into one of aviation's enduring mysteries. Decades of discussion have produced numerous theories, but remarkably few additional facts beyond those already known in 1962. Improvements in underwater search technology, satellite observation, and accident investigation have solved many other historic disappearances, yet those advances depend upon locating evidence to examine. In the case of Flight 739, the Pacific has never yielded the information necessary to apply those modern tools, As a result, the investigation has remained remarkably unchanged despite the passage of more than half a century. Returning to the investigation today means arriving once again at the same final transmission, where investigators themselves were forced to stop. Every subsequent search, every witness interview, every technical assessment, and every proposed explanation eventually circles back to the final routine position report, because nothing conclusively extends the story beyond it. The disappearance therefore occupies an unusual place in aviation history. It is remembered not because investigators uncovered an extraordinary explanation, but because they never obtained the evidence needed to reach one. Maybe the most unsettling aspect of the case is not what remains unknown, but how little the investigation was ever able to move beyond its final confirmed point. The last routine call still stands as the final verified connection between the aircraft and the outside world, while everything beyond that moment remains hidden somewhere beyond the reach of documented history. More than 6 decades later, the Pacific continues to guard whatever happened after those ordinary words were spoken. The final routine position report from Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 still marks the boundary between what aviation can document and what the Pacific has never returned.